Welcome back to another story on Super Harry. This time, we're bringing you, what if Veela Matriarch scanned Harry at age 2, found 340 love potions and declared war on Britain. Your likes fuel our creativity. Subscribe and stay tuned. Here's the story. Chapter 1, The Weight of Chains. The scan was supposed to take 4 hours. Apollon Delacour had done 100 of them. Welfare scans across magical populations were tedious, meticulous work, the kind of thing junior council members usually handled, but she'd insisted on running this one personally. Britain had been resistant to the Veela High Council's goodwill initiatives for 3 years running, and when they'd finally agreed to allow a non-invasive magical welfare survey of their registered population, Apollon had decided that the matriarch showing up herself was the right diplomatic statement. A gesture of respect. Of good faith. She sat in the small office the Ministry of Magic had grudgingly provided, a windowless room on the 4th floor that smelled of old parchment and bureaucratic indifference, and she began the work. Her fingers moved through the air in the precise, dancing patterns her grandmother had taught her, each motion drawing a thread of truth fire from somewhere behind her sternum. The fire wasn't visible to anyone else. It never was, until she wanted it to be. The scan moved across the population registry like fingers through water. Most returns were clean, the ordinary background noise of magical life. A few flags for nutritional deficiencies in children. 2 cases of suppressed accidental magic in Muggle-born infants whose families hadn't yet been contacted by the ministry. Standard findings. She noted them, moved on. At 3 hours and 40 minutes, her fingers stopped. She didn't mean to stop. The pattern her hands were making simply ceased. Like her body had made a decision before her mind caught up. The thread of truth fire in her chest didn't just pulse. It lurched. She looked at the return in her scan field. A child. Male. Magical signature, massive, unusual, with the particular brightness that sometimes appeared in bloodlines carrying very old power. Age, 2 years, 3 months. Name on the registry, Harry James Potter. She almost moved on. The name was familiar, of course, everyone in the magical world knew that name, and she'd expected his file to carry anomalies. Children touched by ancient sacrificial magic tended to read strangely. She'd prepared for that. She had not prepared for this. Apollon pulled the thread tighter, leaning forward in her chair, her elbows on the table and her golden hair falling around her face as she focused. The truth fire spread through the return, reading it more carefully, and the picture it assembled was so wrong, so systematically, deliberately wrong, that for a moment she simply sat very still and breathed. 340 love potion compounds. Layered. Interwoven. Some of them so old they'd partially calcified into the boy's magical core, fused with the tissue of his developing power the way scar tissue fuses with a wound. They weren't crude. That was the thing that kept striking her as she mapped them, they were not the work of someone who didn't know what they were doing. Whoever had placed these had known exactly what a love potion did at the cellular level of magical development, had known that a child's core was more receptive and more vulnerable than an adult's, had known that layers placed in sequence, each slightly different in composition, would compound and reinforce rather than cancel. Had known all of this and done it anyway. Some predated his birth. She checked that finding twice because it seemed impossible, but the dating on the oldest compounds put them at 11, 12 years old. Placed in his mother. Passed through gestation. Others were recent. Within the last year. Someone had accessed this child at the Desley residence and continued the work. The compounds weren't all targeting the same response. That was the other thing. A standard love potion aimed behavior in one direction, toward one person, one feeling. These were sophisticated in a way that made her stomach turn. Different layers targeted different people, different responses. Trust here. Devotion there. Obedience woven through everything like a structural thread. The child was being shaped. Sculpted. Made into something that would feel, with total sincerity, whatever he was designed to feel toward whoever held the appropriate key. Apollon sat back in her chair. Her truth fire had gone very quiet and very cold, which was what it did when she was past anger and into something deeper. She thought about a 2-year-old boy in a house in Surrey with chains around his soul that he couldn't see and couldn't name, loving people on command, trusting people on command, being molded by hands he couldn't identify into a shape designed by people he'd never chosen. She thought about the word grooming and the word enslavement and the word premeditated, and she thought about the fact that someone had started this before he was even born. Then she stood up, rolled the scan results into a tight, precise document of truth fire that only Veela court magic could read or dismiss, and walked out of the windowless office without filing anything with the ministry. She did not say goodbye to the liaison who'd shown her to the room. She apparat directly to Paris. The Veela High Council met in the Palais de Vérités, a building that had no address in any Muggle directory and whose location shifted 3 degrees north every winter solstice, a quirk of the original construction that no one had ever bothered to correct. It sat on the edge of a river that didn't appear on French maps, its white stone walls catching light at angles that suggested the building had opinions about how it wanted to be seen. Apollon called the emergency session herself, which she was entitled to do as matriarch, and the 7 council members arrived within the hour, some of them still adjusting robes, one still carrying a glass of wine she'd clearly decided not to put down. That was Seraphine, the eldest council member at 214, who regarded the world with the particular serenity of someone who had seen every flavor of human catastrophe and stopped being surprised. She set her wine on the council table, carved from a single piece of heartwood that remembered every session conducted over it, and looked at Apollon with sharp, pale eyes. "You look like you touched something poisoned," Seraphine said. "I found something poisoned." Apollon placed the document of truth fire on the table and let it unfurl. The fire rose in a slow column above the heartwood, shifting through amber and white and a deep, grieving blue that several council members had never seen before. "I need you all to look at what I found in Britain today." They looked. They were trained to read truth fire, all of them, and they read it in silence. Apollon watched their faces. She watched Marguerite, who was 26 and the youngest member and had only joined the council last spring, and she watched the color leave Marguerite's face in a slow, steady drain. She watched old Seraphine, who she genuinely believed was past surprise, and she watched the woman's hand tighten around her wine glass until the stem cracked. "This child is 2 years old," said Councillor Beaumont, who handled legal affairs and spoke rarely but precisely. "Yes. And the oldest compounds, these were placed before his birth. While he was in utero." "Yes." The council chamber was quiet. Outside, the river that didn't appear on maps moved past with its characteristic silver light, and somewhere a bird was singing something complicated in French. "Who did this?" Marguerite asked. Her voice was careful in the way that voices get when the person speaking them is trying not to shout. "I don't know yet," Apollon said. "But I know it wasn't one person. The compositional variations in the compounds suggest multiple sources. At least 3 different potion makers. And the access required, you can't layer 340 compounds into a child being raised in a Muggle household without institutional support. Someone with significant power in the British magical establishment is involved. Dumbledore placed this child with Muggles," said Seraphine. She said it the way she said most things, without inflection, as a pure delivery of fact, but the fact itself landed like something thrown. "Yes." Another silence. "What are you proposing?" Beaumont asked. Apollon had been thinking about this since she'd stepped out of that windowless office. She'd been thinking about it on the apparition, in the cold between one place and another, and she'd arrived at her answer the way she usually arrived at answers, not through deliberation but through the truth fire reading what was right and what wasn't. "I'm invoking the Veela Charter of Ancient Wrongs," she said. Article 9. The deliberate magical contamination of a minor's core with intent to control is a war-level offense under our law. It has been since the 16th century. I am not going to send a letter. I am not going to file a complaint with the ICW and wait 18 months for a committee to form. I am going to Britain, and I am going to do this properly. Several council members started talking at once. Apollon waited. The thing about being the matriarch was that you didn't have to raise your voice. You waited, and eventually everyone else ran out of words, and then you spoke into the quiet that followed. I understand the political complications, she said, when they'd finished. I understand that Britain is a sovereign magical nation and that our relationship with the ICW depends on a certain amount of procedural respect. I also understand that a child has had his soul systematically dismantled by someone who believed they would never be caught and never be held accountable. We invoke Article 9, we notify the ICW of our invocation, and we move. If Britain's magical government is clean, they will cooperate and we will work with them. If they are not clean, we will know that within 24 hours of arriving, and we will respond accordingly. She paused. Article 9 has never been invoked in living memory. I want the British ministry to understand that we mean exactly what we say. Seraphine picked up her cracked wine glass, looked at it, and set it down again. You have my vote, she said simply. The vote was 7-0. Marguerite's hand was shaking when she raised it. The ICW representative stationed in London was a man named Gregorovic Aldrich, a broad, red-faced Bulgarian who had held the post for 11 years and considered himself something of a diplomatic institution. He had a large office in a building adjacent to the Ministry of Magic, an impressive collection of magical artifacts that he claimed were gifts from various governments but were mostly purchases, and a talent for making everyone who walked through his door feel that their problem was both very serious and entirely manageable and that he personally would handle it at the earliest opportunity. Apollon arrived at his office at 7:30 in the morning, before his assistant had arrived, before his coffee had been made, before he'd had time to construct the architecture of managed calm that he operated behind during working hours. She did not knock. The lock on his door was good, ministry-grade enchantments, recently renewed, but Truthfire didn't negotiate with locks. Aldrich looked up from the document he was reading and did a thing with his face that was almost comical, surprise layering into recognition, layering into the specific professional panic of a man who has just realized that the situation he is in is considerably above his management grade. Matriarch Delacour, he said, and to his credit his voice only caught slightly. I wasn't expecting, I'm invoking Article 9 of the Veela Charter of Ancient Wrongs, Apollon said, crossing the room and placing the copy of her documentation on his desk. It was a Muggle paper copy this time. She'd had it printed because she wanted him to be able to hold it, to feel its weight, to not have the option of pretending it was abstract. The invocation covers the child Harry James Potter, age 2, resident at number 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. The full scan documentation is enclosed. The High Council voted unanimously at 11:15 last night. Aldrich looked at the document. He looked at her. He reached for the document and opened it and read the first page with the careful attention of a man who very much wanted to find a technical problem that would allow him to send this somewhere else. This is, he started. Read the compounds list, Apollon said. Page 4. He turned to page 4. She watched him read. She watched his red face go through several colors it probably wasn't designed to produce. 340, he said. 340. And the oldest, were placed in his mother before he was born. Yes. Aldrich closed the document. He had the look of a man who was doing very rapid calculations about his career, his pension, his comfortable 11 years in this office, and the shape of the next several months of his life. The ICW will need time to, the ICW has 48 hours to formally acknowledge the invocation, Apollon said. That's the treaty requirement. I know the timeline. I also know that your personal relationship with Minister Bagnold is well documented and that you've played golf with Albus Dumbledore on 4 separate occasions. She let that sit for exactly 2 seconds. I'm telling you this so that we understand each other clearly. I'm not asking for your help. I'm notifying you of my actions, as the treaty requires. What you do with that notification is your business. But if I find out that you've used your 48-hour window to give anyone involved in this the opportunity to destroy evidence or access the child, I will bring a separate action under Article 12 and I will name you personally. She didn't say it loudly. She didn't need to. Aldrich stared at her. Article 12, he repeated, almost involuntarily. That hasn't been invoked since 1743. I know. I'm something of a traditionalist. She turned to go, then stopped. You should also know that the French Minister for Magic was briefed at midnight. This is not, and will not become, a quiet matter. She walked out. The Ministry of Magic was already buzzing when she arrived. News moved fast in magical Britain, she'd found, or rather, fear of news moved fast, which wasn't quite the same thing. She'd been in the building for 4 minutes when she was intercepted by a harassed-looking wizard in ministry robes who introduced himself as Bartemius Crouch Sr., head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, and who did so with the air of a man who had been briefed in the last 30 minutes and was operating on insufficient information and too much coffee. Matriarch Delacour. He was tall, precise, with the kind of face that had probably been handsome 20 years ago and had since resolved itself into authoritative angles. I hope we can discuss whatever has brought you to us this morning before anything, he searched for the word, precipitous occurs. I've already filed the invocation with Aldrich, Apollon said pleasantly. Nothing precipitous. Just paperwork. She looked around the atrium. Wizards and witches were pausing in their morning commute to stare, and she let them stare. Let the staring become a kind of broadcast. I would like to speak with Minister Bagnold. And I would like access to the Potions Analysis Division of your Department of Mysteries. I have samples that need independent verification. The Department of Mysteries doesn't, Crouch began. Yes it does, Apollon said. Article 9 gives me the right to request independent forensic analysis from the host nation's most senior magical researchers. It's Section 3, subsection B. I assume your legal team has already pulled the treaty. He had not, she could tell from the fractional tightening around his eyes, expected her to know the treaty better than he did. Most people didn't expect that. Most people looked at golden hair and Veela warmth and assumed something softer was behind it. I'll arrange a meeting with the minister, he said, with the careful dignity of a man recalibrating. Wonderful. I'll be in your atrium cafe. I'd like tea. Real tea, not that peppermint nonsense. She smiled at him, not the Veela smile, not the one that rewired people's thinking, but the human one, which was sometimes more unnerving. I'm not going anywhere, Mr. Crouch. You have time to make proper arrangements. I just want you to understand that I am here, I am staying, and I have documentation that will survive any legal challenge Britain's magical establishment can construct. So perhaps speed is worth more than caution at this particular moment. She turned toward the cafe. Behind her, she heard Crouch moving, quickly, toward the lifts. Minister Millicent Bagnold was 63, had survived 4 political crises and 2 attempts to unseat her, and had the particular quality of experienced politicians everywhere. She could listen to catastrophically bad news and produce, on her face, the expression of someone receiving slightly inconvenient good news. They met in Bagnold's office at 10 in the morning. Apollon sat across from her. Between them on the desk was the full documentation, and Crouch stood to one side looking like he'd rather be anywhere else, and a legal advisor named Wexler sat to the other side with a quill and parchment that he kept almost touching. The findings are extraordinary, Bagnold said, in the tone of someone choosing adjectives very carefully. And we take them extraordinarily seriously. However, I want to ensure that we're 340, Apollon said. I want to say that number to you directly, Minister, and I want to ask you to sit with it for a moment. 340 individual compounds in a 2-year-old child. Not accumulated by accident. Not a magical anomaly. Deliberately. Methodically. Over a period of years that includes the time before this child was born. She paused. I am not here to create a political problem for your government. I'm here because a child was used like a puppet and someone in your magical establishment either did it or allowed it. Article 9 exists precisely for this situation. My question for you is not whether you'll cooperate. The treaty makes cooperation mandatory. My question is whether you'll cooperate well or badly, and whether history will record the British ministry as having protected a child or protected the people who harmed him. Bagnold was quiet for a moment. She was, Apollon had decided, genuinely intelligent, which meant she understood all the ways this could go wrong for her government and was computing them simultaneously with the social cost of being on the wrong side of what Apollon was describing. What do you need? Bagnold asked. Independent access to the child. Full forensic analysis by a mixed team of Veela and Ministry Potions experts. Cooperation with my investigation in identifying the source of the compounds. And, Apollon placed a second document on the desk. I need you to explain this. Bagnold looked at the document. It was Dumbledore's placement order for Harry Potter. Signed by Dumbledore. Filed with the Ministry. No legal basis cited, no court order, no documentation of consent from any magical guardian. Sirius Black, who was named as godfather in the Potter's will, hadn't been consulted. The child had simply been moved to a Muggle residence by one man's unilateral decision on the night his parents were murdered. Albus Dumbledore is a private citizen, Bagnold said, and her voice had tightened almost imperceptibly. He acts in no official ministry capacity, and yet this placement order is filed in your ministry registry, in your official records, stamped with your office's seal. Apollon tapped the document. Someone in this building signed off on it. I want to know who. The legal advisor Wexler had stopped moving his quill entirely. I'll have someone look into, Bagnold began. I need a name by end of today, Apollon said. That's not a demand. That's just good faith. If you give me a name, I can proceed on the investigative track. If you don't, I need to consider why that information is being protected and by whom, and that moves us into different territory. She stood. She didn't need to stay any longer. The meeting had accomplished what she'd needed it to. She'd established, in front of witnesses, that she had legal standing, that she knew what she was doing, and that the ministry's cooperation was expected and documented as expected. If they failed to cooperate, that failure would become part of the record. My delegation will be staying at Le Quartier Enchanté in Diagon Alley, she said, referring to the only French-owned magical establishment in London. We'll be there through the duration of the investigation. I expect to hear from your office by 6 this evening. She looked at Bagnold steadily. One more thing. I am told that Albus Dumbledore is likely to contact you in the next few hours. He'll have a great deal to say, and he will say all of it very compellingly, and most of it will be true. I want you to remember, when you're listening to him, that truth can be arranged. 340 compounds in a child. That is not arrangement. That is a fact that exists independent of whatever story is built around it. She left the way she'd come. Le Quartier Enchanté was a narrow building squeezed between Flourish and Blots and a shop selling self-correcting astronomical instruments, easy to miss if you didn't know to look for the small tricolor flag worked in silver thread above the door. Inside it was larger than outside, as most things in Diagon Alley were, and smelled of good coffee and something savory that was being prepared in the kitchen downstairs. Apollon's delegation was already there, for Veela court advocates, 2 independent potions experts she'd brought from Lyon, and Seraphine, who had insisted on coming and who was sitting by the window with a fresh glass of wine and a French newspaper and the air of someone who had come on holiday and happened to bring a war with her. How did it go? Marguerite asked, looking up from a table covered in treaty documents. As expected. Apollon dropped into a chair and accepted the coffee someone handed her. Bagnold is smart and scared. Crouch is rigid but not stupid. Aldrich is going to try to send a message to Dumbledore and will believe he's being subtle about it. Do we have someone watching Aldrich? Seraphine asked without looking up from her newspaper. We have 3 people watching Aldrich, Apollon said. We also have someone at the Dursley house. Marguerite looked up sharply. You sent someone to the child already? I sent someone to observe, Apollon said. Not to engage. Not yet. She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. I want to know what's happening there before I move. I want to know if the potions are still being administered. I want to know what his living situation is. She paused. I want to know if he's safe. The room was quiet for a moment. The response from the ICW representative in Paris came in an hour ago, Marguerite said, pulling a parchment from the stack in front of her. They're acknowledging the invocation formally. They're not happy. They never are. There's also a message from Dumbledore. Apollon looked at the parchment Marguerite was holding out. She didn't take it immediately. What does it say? It says he'd like to meet with you at your earliest convenience. That he believes there's been a misunderstanding. That he's deeply concerned about the nature of the allegations and would like the opportunity to provide context. Marguerite paused. He calls you, my dear Apollon. Apollon picked up the parchment and read it. It was beautifully written, warm, measured, radiating exactly the kind of gentle authority that made Albus Dumbledore the most trusted man in magical Britain. She could feel the craft in it, the way each sentence built trust by seeming not to try. She set it down. Tell him I'll meet with him tomorrow morning. 9 o'clock, here. Not his office, not Hogwarts, not anywhere he controls the environment. She considered. And tell him I'll be bringing our full forensic documentation and that I look forward to the context he can provide. You want him to know you're not walking in blind. I want him to know exactly how much I know before he decides how much to say. She drank her coffee. He's going to try to explain this. That's fine. I want to hear the explanation. What you learn from how a person explains the inexplicable is often more useful than what you learn from the act itself. Seraphine turned a page of her newspaper. Smart man, Dumbledore, she said conversationally. I met him in 1949. He was smart then, too. Smart men are the most dangerous kind, Apollon said. Yes. Seraphine finally looked up from her newspaper, and there was something in her pale, ancient eyes that wasn't quite amusement and wasn't quite sadness. They always believe that being right about most things means they can't be wrong about the ones that matter. Outside, Diagon Alley was doing what it always did, bustling, noisy, full of the cheerful transactional energy of people buying and selling magical goods and not thinking about politics. Apollon watched a child run past the window chasing a magical toy, and she thought about a house in Surrey, and a 2-year-old boy, and chains made of something that was supposed to be love. Her truth fire hadn't cooled since yesterday. It was still doing that quiet, cold thing it did when the wrong she was perceiving was too large for heat. At 4:30, the observer she'd sent to Privet Drive sent his report. She read it. Then she went very still for a long moment, sitting at the window with the report in her hand and the noise of the alley coming through the glass, muffled and distant and belonging to a world that was moving along without any awareness of what was quietly being uncovered inside it. The report confirmed active potion administration. Not naturally occurring, someone was visiting the Dursley house. The child was showing signs consistent with magical suppression beyond the potion effects. The living conditions were what you would call, in diplomatic language, inadequate, and what you would call in ordinary language, cruel. And there was something else. The observer, a young advocate named Thierry who was very good at his job, had gotten close enough to the house to run a secondary scan. The magical suppression wasn't just from the potions. There was a ward on the house. An old ward. The kind that used blood and pain and the specific frequency of a child's distress to generate a protection that kept something out. Someone had built a protection for the magical world using this child's suffering as a fuel source. Apollon folded the report carefully and put it in her coat pocket. Marguerite, she said quietly. Yes. Tell the advocates we're revising our approach. We're not waiting for Bagnold's response by 6. We're going to Privet Drive tomorrow morning. Before the meeting with Dumbledore. She stood. And tell Thierry to stay where he is tonight. If anyone comes to that house with potions, I want to know immediately. Should I tell him to stop them if, yes. There was nothing complicated about that answer. Absolutely yes. She moved toward the stairs. Behind her, she heard Marguerite picking up a quill and beginning to write with the focused energy of someone who understood that the shape of the next few days was being determined right now, in this room, by these choices. Seraphine's voice drifted up from the table, unhurried. You know, the old woman said, I've been waiting for someone to invoke Article 9 since about 1954. I had begun to think it would never happen in my lifetime. Apollon paused on the stairs. What changed your mind? Seraphine smiled. It was a slow smile, the kind that had seen things. You became matriarch, she said simply. Apollon went upstairs. The truth fire in her chest burned cold and clear and perfectly still, the way it did when she had found her direction and stopped needing to search. Tomorrow she would go to a house in Surrey and collect a 2-year-old boy with 340 chains around his soul. And then she would find out, one by one, who had put them there. Chapter 2, The shape of the conspiracy. The house on Privet Drive was aggressively normal. That was the first thing Apollon noticed, the way it performed normalcy with an almost aggressive commitment, as though the house itself understood that it was hiding something and had decided the best camouflage was to be the most ordinary house on a street of ordinary houses. Same beige exterior as its neighbors. Same manicured patch of lawn. Same net curtains in the windows, slightly parted, through which someone was definitely watching the street. She'd come with Marguerite, Thierry, and one of the lion potions experts, a compact, serious woman named Diar. Celeste Fontaine, who carried her equipment in a bag that looked like an ordinary leather satchel and was anything but. They'd dressed in Muggle clothes, a concession to keeping the street from erupting in confusion, and they'd apparat to a point 2 streets over and walked. It was early, just past 7, and the September air was cool and smelled of cut grass and car exhaust and the particular sadness of English suburban mornings. Thierry had met them at the corner, looking rumpled from a night of observation, and had walked beside Apollon with his voice low. No visitors last night, he'd said. I watched until 4, then ran the monitoring charm on a loop. No magical signatures approached the property. A pause. The child cried for about an hour around midnight. No one came. Apollon hadn't said anything. She just kept walking. She knocked on the door of number 4 at 7:15. She heard movement inside immediately, the kind of sudden, startled movement that suggested someone had been watching from behind the net curtains and was now scrambling to respond to something they hadn't decided how to handle yet. The door opened. Vernon Dursley was a large man going red in the face even before he'd registered who he was looking at, which told Apollon quite a lot about him in about 2 seconds. He was wearing a mustard yellow tie that he'd already knotted before 7 in the morning, which told her a few more things. Yes, he said, in the voice of a man who said yes the way other people said go away. My name is Apollon Delacour, she said, in precise English. I am the Matriarch of the Veela High Council and a credentialed officer of the International Confederation of Wizards under Article 9 of the Charter of Ancient Wrongs. I am here regarding Harry Potter. She held up the documentation, the paper copy again, because physical paper had weight and weight was useful. I have the legal right to access and assess the child. I would prefer to do this with your cooperation. I will do it without your cooperation if I have to. Vernon stared at her. Behind him, a small pale woman appeared at the end of the hallway with the expression of someone who had always known this day was coming and had hoped very much it wouldn't. You people, Vernon said. You absolute, Mr. Dursley. Her voice didn't rise. Where is the child? Something in the way she said it, flat, clear, not a question in any operational sense, broke through whatever was building in Vernon's chest. He stepped back. He didn't decide to step back. His body simply did it. Petunia Dursley, for her part, looked not angry but frightened, which was more interesting. She had the look of a woman carrying something heavy that she'd been carrying so long she'd stopped noticing the weight until right now, when someone was asking her to put it down. He's upstairs, Petunia said. First door on the left. Petunia. Vernon turned on her. Vernon. Her voice was quiet and completely flat. Let them go upstairs. The room was a cupboard. Not a small room. Not a modest room with the word cupboard applied loosely. An actual cupboard, under the stairs, with a cot wedged into it at an angle and a single bare bulb and a smell of must and the particular staleness of a space not meant for sleeping. Thierry had his jaw set in a very controlled way. Marguerite was looking at the door of the cupboard with an expression that suggested she was deciding, in real time, how she felt about her opinion of the British wizarding establishment. Harry Potter was awake. He was sitting up in the cot looking at them through the open cupboard door with enormous green eyes that were extraordinarily bright in his small face, and he was absolutely silent. Not the silence of a child who was happy and calm. The silence of a child who had learned that silence was the safe option. The silence of a child who was watching and waiting and not moving until he understood what was going to happen next. He was small for 2. Not dramatically so, children varied, but he was slightly under where he should have been, and his dark hair was growing in all directions, and he had a scar on his forehead in the shape of a lightning bolt that the file had told her about but which was somehow more real and more wrong when you were looking at it in person. He looked at Apollon. She crouched down so she was at his level. This was not a strategic decision, though it was good strategy. She just didn't want to loom over him. She'd done enough looming this morning. Bonjour, she said softly. Then, switching, hello. Harry looked at her. His eyes tracked over her face with a carefulness that was striking in a toddler. Reading her, she realized, the way a child reads a situation they don't trust. Checking for something. Hello, he said. His voice was small and gravelly from sleep. The truth fire in her chest did something complicated, not the cold anger from yesterday but something that moved differently, more like water than like fire. She breathed through it. My name is Apollon, she said. I'm going to have my friend look at your magic, if that's all right. It won't hurt. He considered this with total seriousness. Then he held out one small hand, palm up, in a gesture that was somehow both cooperative and cautious, and Apollon felt the complicated thing in her chest move again. Dr. Fontaine knelt beside her and opened her satchel with quiet, practiced movements. The equipment she drew out looked, in its muggle form, like a small compass. In its actual form, when she activated it, it cast a pale light over Harry's hand and began to read. Apollon watched Fontaine's face. She'd chosen Fontaine specifically because the woman almost never reacted expressively. She was the kind of scientist who prided herself on empirical distance. 20 years of potions analysis in the most difficult forensic cases the Veela Council had ever handled, and Fontaine's face during an assessment was usually as readable as a wall. Right now, Fontaine's face was doing something around the eyes and the corners of her mouth that suggested the empirical distance was working very hard. All 340 are still active, Fontaine said, after 2 minutes. Her voice was the same calibrated neutral it always was. The only evidence of what she was feeling was in the precision of her neutrality, the way she was working to maintain it. The most recent layer was placed approximately 6 days ago. She paused. Matriarch, the suppression ward is also still active. It's pulling from his distress responses. Every time he experiences negative emotional stimulation, the ward refreshes. Someone designed that, Apollon said. Yes. This isn't. Fontaine glanced at Harry, who was watching her compass with solemn curiosity, and chose her next words carefully. This isn't incidental. This is engineering. Whoever built the suppression ward understood magical childhood development at a clinical level. The distress refresh mechanism it's elegant, technically. In the same way a well-made trap is elegant. Harry reached out and touched the compass with one finger. It chimed softly, which seemed to surprise him. The corner of his mouth moved. Apollon stood. She went back to the hallway, where Vernon and Petunia were standing with the particular posture of people who had been told to stay put and had complied more out of shock than obedience. The charmed object, she said to Petunia. The one that administers the compounds. Where is it? Petunia's face went through 3 different things. I don't know what you mean. Someone has been coming here every 6 days and accessing this child with a potion compound. Not through food or drink, the delivery is direct, through a charm or a charmed object. If you didn't administer it yourself, then someone gave you something to keep in this house. An object. Something you were told to keep near him. She looked at Petunia steadily. I don't think you knew what it was. I think someone told you it was for his safety. Petunia went very still. Vernon looked at his wife with an expression that was trying to be angry and kept sliding into uncertain. Upstairs, Petunia said quietly. In the 2nd bedroom. In the wardrobe. There's a stuffed toy. An owl. Someone left it. There was a note. It said it would help him sleep, that it would keep him calm. She stopped. I thought it was one of them. I thought it was just, she pressed her lips together. I put it in the wardrobe because I didn't want it near Dudley. Fontaine was already moving toward the stairs. Apollon stayed where she was. Petunia, she said. Did you choose to take this child? The question landed in the hallway like a stone into still water. Vernon said, loudly, now see here, no, Petunia said. Her voice was completely flat. No, I didn't choose. He was left on my doorstep. There was a letter. From Dumbledore. It said Harry had to stay here, that there were protections, that we had no choice. She looked at Apollon directly for the first time since the conversation started. We've never had a choice about any of it. It wasn't an excuse. Apollon didn't take it as one. But it was information, and information had value regardless of whether it was comfortable. You have a choice now, Apollon said. I'm taking him. I would like your formal agreement to that, witnessed by my colleagues, on record. Or I can remove him under Article 9 mandate, which requires no agreement from you. Either way, he's leaving. She paused. If you agree, it's better for you legally. I'm not trying to threaten you. I'm trying to give you the option of cooperation. Vernon started to say something. Petunia touched his arm and he stopped. It was a small gesture with enormous authority in it. Take him, Petunia said. Take him and, just tell whoever you're telling that we weren't told the truth. About any of it. That man, Dumbledore, he told us the magic would hurt Dudley if Harry left. That it would hurt our whole street. She stopped. Steadied. We were afraid of him. Of what he could do. Fontaine came back down the stairs with a stuffed owl in her gloved hand. She held it out to Apollon without a word. Apollon looked at it, ordinary looking, soft, brown, the kind of thing you'd find in any toy shop. She didn't touch it. Is it charmed? Extensively. Fontaine's voice had gone fully neutral in the way that meant she was furious. The primary charm is a continuous release potion delivery system. 6-day cycle. Secondary charm monitors magical output and feeds the data to, somewhere. A receiving point. I'll need to trace the signature properly. She paused. The potion in the delivery system right now, Matriarch, it's a variant I haven't seen before. Some of the compounds are standard love potion base, but there's something else woven through. Something behavioral. Something designed for a much older target. This was formulated for an adult's magical system, but it's been running in a toddler's body since, she checked the charm dating. Since November of last year. Someone wanted to get a head start, Marguerite said from the doorway, her voice very quiet and very cold. Apollon looked at the stuffed owl for a long moment. Then she looked at Petunia. The letter that came with this. Do you still have it? Petunia went to the kitchen. She came back with a letter that had been kept in a drawer, folded and refolded many times into a small, compressed square. She held it out. Apollon took it, opened it, read it. The handwriting was distinctive. Round, fluid, a little ornate. She'd seen it on enough ministry documents in the last 24 hours to recognize it. It wasn't Dumbledore's hand. She'd expected Dumbledore's hand. She stared at the letter and read it again and turned it over and felt the truth fire in her chest do something specific and focused, the way it did when a fact was important. The letter was signed with initials only. M.W. Marguerite, she said quietly, folding the letter and putting it in her coat pocket beside Thierry's report from last night. When we get back, I need you to pull the British Potions Guild membership rolls from 1980 to present. Cross-reference with anyone who has documented contact with Dumbledore's inner circle. Flag everyone with the initials M.W. You know who it is? Marguerite asked. Not yet. But I will. She turned back toward the cupboard under the stairs. Harry was standing in the doorway of it now, watching her with those bright, careful eyes. He'd pulled a ragged stuffed rabbit from somewhere in the cot and was holding it against his chest in the automatic way children hold their comfort objects, not performing comfort but actually taking it. Apollon crouched down again. Harry, she said. We're going to go somewhere else now. Somewhere nicer. Is that all right? He looked at her for a long time. Then he looked back at the cupboard, at the cot and the bare bulb, with an expression that was too complicated for a 2-year-old to be wearing, some mixture of the familiar and the not quite right that even very small children understood when they understood nothing else about their situation. He held out his free hand. The one not holding the rabbit. She took it. Back at Le Quartier Enchanté, Fontaine set up her analysis equipment in the largest room on the first floor and began the process of properly cataloging the compounds with the kind of focused speed that came from genuine outrage redirected into work. Seraphine sat in the corner and watched and said nothing, and her saying nothing was more expressive than most people's full sentences. Harry sat on a small sofa with his rabbit and watched Fontaine's instruments with the same careful attention he'd applied to everything since they'd arrived. He'd been quiet in the car. Apollon had hired a Muggle taxi, feeling that apparition with an unknown child was too disorienting, and quiet when they'd come through the door of the enchanted building, but his eyes were working constantly, reading and filing and reading again. Not fearful. Watchful. There was a difference. Marguerite had found some fruit and a small pot of yogurt in the kitchen, and Harry had eaten both with a focused attention that made Apollon wonder, without wanting to follow the thought too far, how often he was hungry. He's remarkably self-contained, Seraphine said quietly, from the corner. He learned to be, Apollon said, equally quiet. His magic is extraordinary even suppressed. You can feel it from across the room. Seraphine tilted her head slightly, watching Harry arrange 3 pieces of apple into a triangle with total concentration. When Fontaine removes the suppression, one thing at a time. Of course. Seraphine picked up her wine. I'm just noting that we should be prepared. At 9:30, Albus Dumbledore arrived. He was exactly what she'd expected and still somehow more than she'd prepared for. He was tall, white-bearded, robed in deep blue, and he radiated the specific quality of deep goodness that people sometimes confused for wisdom. His half-moon spectacles caught the light when he walked through the door of Le Quartier Enchanté, and his eyes above them were that famous twinkling blue, and he looked at the room with an expression of warm, measured gravity that said, in its entirety, I am here to help, and I am not going to rush, and everything will be all right. His eyes found Harry immediately. Something moved across his face, something that was, Apollon noted with precision, genuine. He did care about the child. That was real. Whatever Albus Dumbledore was, he was not a man performing concern for Harry Potter. The concern was there, and it was true, and it lived in him alongside everything else. That was what made him dangerous in the specific way he was dangerous. Apollon, he said warmly, and she watched him decide to use her first name and make it feel natural. Mr. Dumbledore, she said. Sit down, please. He sat. He looked around the room, at Marguerite's parchments, at Fontaine's equipment, at Seraphine in the corner, at Harry on the sofa, and he looked at it all with the unhurried attention of a man reading a board and deciding his next move. "I see you've already retrieved Harry," he said, and his voice carried a gentle note of something that walked up to the edge of reproach without crossing it. "He was living in a cupboard," Apollon said. A pause. "I was not aware of the specifics of 340 love potion compounds, Mr. Dumbledore." She placed Fontaine's preliminary analysis on the table between them. "Dr. Fontaine is completing the full catalogue now. The preliminary findings confirm what my original scan detected and add 3 further findings. First, a suppression ward drawing power from the child's distress. Second, an active delivery mechanism concealed in a charmed toy, an owl, that someone placed in the Dursley household approximately 10 months ago. Third, and most significantly, she placed the initialed letter on the table beside the analysis. This was found in the Dursley home. The letter that accompanied the charmed toy. The initials M.W. I'd like to know who you know with those initials." Dumbledore looked at the letter. He looked at it for longer than he needed to, which meant it meant something to him, and he was deciding how much of that to show. "Where did you find this?" he asked. "In Petunia Dursley's kitchen drawer. She kept everything, it seems." Apollon leaned back in her chair. The letter warned her that Harry's magic would harm her family if he left the house. "That's an interesting lie to tell someone, Mr. Dumbledore. It suggests that whoever told it understood Petunia Dursley's psychology quite well. Her fear of magic. Her relationship with her sister. The specific shape of what would frighten her into compliance." Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. He folded his hands on the table, and Apollon watched the gesture because it was the gesture of a man centering himself, and she wanted to see him have to do that. "I want you to understand," he said, "the situation as it existed in November of 1981. Voldemort had just fallen. The wizarding world was in an extraordinarily vulnerable state. Harry Potter was, and remains, the subject of a prophecy that—" "Stop," Apollon said. He stopped. It seemed to mildly surprise him that it worked. "I don't want the context yet," she said. "I want the answer to a specific question. The compounds in this child, some of them predate his birth. They were in his mother. Did you know about them?" A very long pause. The room held its breath. "I was aware," Dumbledore said carefully, "that Lily Potter's magical signature had certain anomalies toward the end of her pregnancy. I attributed them to the stresses of— Did you investigate those anomalies?" Another pause. "I considered it and decided that— Did you investigate them?" "No." The single word fell into the room and lay there. "You were the most powerful and most informed wizard in Britain," Apollon said, "and you noticed anomalies in the magical signature of a pregnant woman in your inner circle, in a time of active war when you knew your inner circle was compromised, and you decided not to investigate. The decision I made was, I'm not asking you to justify it yet. I'm establishing what happened." She made a small note. "The suppression ward on the Dursley house. Did you build it?" This pause was different. Shorter. He'd had more time to prepare this answer. "The protective ward on Privet Drive uses the blood bond between Harry and his mother's sister to— I asked if you built it." "Yes." "And the mechanism that draws power from Harry's distress, was that intentional?" "The ward requires—" He stopped. "Tried again. The theoretical framework for blood wards of this type requires a sympathetic resonance between the protected subject and the anchor, Mr. Dumbledore." Apollon's voice was still entirely level, still entirely calm. "I have been doing this for 11 years. I have heard every variation of the theory required it, and the mechanism demanded it from people who built terrible things and believed in the necessity of building them. What I am asking you is very simple. Did you know that this child's fear and pain were fueling the ward you built around him?" He met her eyes. His own were complicated behind the half-moon spectacles, not lying, because she didn't think he was lying, but choosing. Choosing which truth to put in front of her. "I knew the ward was sustained by the environment," he said finally. I believed the environment, while not ideal, was adequate. I believed the protection it generated was worth the cost. You decided that a child's suffering had an acceptable price. I decided that a child's survival was more important than his comfort. And now there was something different in his voice, not defensive but genuine, the sound of a man who believed what he was saying and had believed it for years and had built entire structures of thought around it. Harry Potter cannot die, Apollon. Not yet. There are things in motion, don't call me Apollon, she said quietly. He stopped. We are not colleagues, she said. We are not collaborators. I am an ICW credentialed officer conducting a formal investigation into the deliberate magical contamination of a minor, and you are someone whose name keeps appearing in the evidence. You can call me Matriarch Delacour, or you can say nothing at all. She looked at him steadily. I'm going to ask you about MW now. Who is it? The twinkling had gone. What was left in his eyes was something older and harder and, she thought, more honest. Molly Weasley, he said. The name sat on the table alongside the letter and the potions analysis. Molly Weasley. Mother of 7. Member of Dumbledore's Order of the Phoenix. By all accounts a woman of volcanic affection and total loyalty to the people she had decided were hers. She was asked to provide a specific compound, Dumbledore said, in the tone of someone who had decided on partial transparency and was navigating its edges. A love and loyalty compound. To be administered through a charmed object. The intention was to ensure that when Harry Potter grew old enough to enter the wizarding world, he would be receptive to guidance. That he would trust the right people. The right people being, Marguerite said from across the room, and her voice was doing something remarkable with the effort of staying professional, the people who decided they were the right people. Dumbledore's eyes moved to her briefly, then back to Apollon. The compounds you found are not all Molly's work. Several of them I recognize from other sources. Some were placed by people who no longer share my intentions. Who were pursuing their own versions of what Harry should become. How many people have been using this child as a project? Seraphine asked, from her corner, in perfect conversational French. Dumbledore understood French. His eyes moved to her and the look that passed between them was something between recognition and a very old, very tired argument. The compounds are from at least 3 distinct sources, Apollon said. She'd stood and moved to Fontaine's equipment table and was reading the ongoing analysis with Fontaine's running annotations. Dar. Fontaine has identified a primary group, these are the ones in Lily Potter's blood work, predating the child's birth. A secondary group added in the first year of his life, while his parents were still alive. And a third group added after November 1981, while he's been at the Dursleys. The first group, Dumbledore said. Yes. I did not place those, he said, and this time she was very sure he wasn't lying. I didn't know they existed until your scan. That is the truth. Then who did? He was quiet. Mr. Dumbledore. The compositional signature, he said slowly, of the earliest compounds, the ones in Lily Potter's blood, is consistent with potions work from the 1960s and early 1970s. A specific style. Before the war. He paused. The only person I knew who worked in that style, with that level of sophistication, was Horace Slughorn. Fontaine's head came up from her analysis. The former Hogwarts potions professor. Yes. Slughorn, Seraphine said, and her tone had gone somewhere interesting. The man who collects famous students. Who kept a private social club. Who had Lily Evans as one of his star pupils. Who might have had access to Lily Evans, Marguerite said, before she was Lily Potter. When she was a student. Before she was famous for anything except being very talented at potions. The room was very quiet. He was setting up contingencies, Apollon said. Not a question. He was placing compounds in people he thought might matter later. Talented students, children of prominent families. Insurance policies. Not, She looked at Fontaine, not the same goal as whoever added the behavioral layers later. Slughorn's original compounds, what were they targeting? Fontaine scrolled through her notes. Attachment. Loyalty. Specifically targeted at the placement figure. The person in authority. Whoever Slughorn designed this for, he wanted the eventual child to feel a deep and unchosen attachment to whichever mentor figure they encountered. She paused. It would have made Harry Potter an extraordinarily good student. Deeply trusting of teachers. Eager to please. Willing to follow guidance. And the layers added afterward, Apollon said. Molly Weasley's compounds. What were they targeting? Familial loyalty. Specifically, the Weasley family signature is all over the emotional targeting. Whoever Harry Potter loved first, he was going to love like a brother or son. But the Weasley affinity is woven through all of it: red hair, a specific domestic magical signature, the frequency of large families. He was going to want to belong to them. Seraphine was looking at Dumbledore. You put this child with Muggles and arranged for a wizarding family to be his first magical contact when the time came. Dumbledore didn't answer. He didn't need to. The third source, Apollon said. The layers added after November 1981. Those aren't Slughorn style and they're not Weasley's domestic brewing. No, Fontaine said. The third source is considerably more advanced. Military grade, almost. The behavioral compounds, the obedience layers. These are designed to make the subject manageable in specific high-risk situations. They're designed to make him run toward danger willingly and not question why. She set down her notes. Matriarch, the third source compounds are designed to make Harry Potter self-sacrificing. Not accidentally. Not as a personality trait. It's engineered. Someone wanted to make sure that when the time came, whatever that means, he would choose death over self-preservation. The room went completely still. Harry, on his sofa, had fallen asleep with his rabbit against his chest, his dark hair fanned out against the cushion, his expression for the first time since they'd arrived at Privet Drive simply, open. Unguarded. The face of a sleeping child, ordinary and defenseless and fine. Apollon looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Dumbledore, and whatever he saw in her face made him sit back very slightly. The third source, she said. Give me a name. He met her eyes. I don't know for certain who, give me your best theory. A long pause. Severus Snape, he said quietly. Or someone who learned from him. Snape. A Death Eater. A former Death Eater. A man who has been placing compounds in this child designed to make him choose to die, Apollon said, and the truth fire had moved all the way through cold and into something on the other side of it, something that was past temperature entirely. You are going to sit there, and you are going to tell me everything about the prophecy, and everything about your plans for this child, and everything about every person in your organization who has touched him or his family since 1970. And you are going to do this because the alternative is that I release Dr. Fontaine's analysis to every ICW member state simultaneously and hold a press conference in Diagon Alley this afternoon, and by tonight everyone in the magical world will know that Albus Dumbledore, she leaned forward slightly, built a child's destiny out of chains and called it protection. He looked at her. She looked at him. This was the moment, she knew, where people like him either decided to cooperate or decided to fight, and the whole shape of the next few months balanced on which way they went. Dumbledore's hands unfolded from the table. He reached into his robes and produced a small leather notebook, and he set it in front of her, and he said, "There is something else you need to know first." She looked at the notebook. "There is a man in Azkaban prison," Dumbledore said, "who should not be there. He has been there for a year. He was placed there without trial." Apollon waited. "His name is Sirius Black," Dumbledore said. "He is Harry's godfather." "And what was done to him?" The old man stopped, and something genuinely painful moved across his face. the honest pain of a man who had made a decision he hadn't fully examined and had chosen not to look at the consequences, was wrong. It was wrong, and I allowed it, and that too will be in your documentation eventually, so I am telling you now before you find it yourself. Marguerite put down her quill. Fontaine stopped moving at her equipment table. Seraphine's hand stilled around her wine glass. Apollon looked at the notebook. She looked at Dumbledore. She thought about a 2-year-old boy asleep on a sofa with a rabbit, and a man in a prison designed to eat souls, and 340 chains, and initials on a letter, and the word wrong coming out of the mouth of a man who had known it was wrong for a year and had not moved. "We're going to need more documentation," she said to Marguerite, very calmly. Marguerite was already pulling fresh parchment. Chapter 3, The Lion's Response. The Daily Prophet ran the story on a Thursday. Apollon hadn't planted it. She hadn't needed to. 22 ministry employees had seen her walk through the atrium. Aldrich had presumably talked to someone. Diagon Alley had eyes on every surface, and Le Quartier and Chante had been receiving a steady stream of curious looks since Tuesday. The story was going to come out regardless, the only variable was the shape it arrived in. The shape it arrived in was not good. Foreign agitator seizes boy who lived, Veela Matriarch as brazen kidnapping stuns Wizarding Britain. Read the headline, in the Prophet's particular brand of font that suggested both emergency and moral certainty. The article was 3 columns wide and featured a photograph of Apollon walking out of the ministry building on Tuesday morning that someone had taken without her noticing, which was mildly annoying. She looked, in the photograph, like exactly what she was, purposeful, unhurried, completely certain, and the Prophet had captioned it, Delacour, here on official business, with the quotation marks doing heavy lifting. She read the article over coffee at 7 in the morning. Harry was still asleep upstairs in the room Marguerite had arranged for him, a real room, with a proper bed and a window, and the building was quiet in the particular way buildings got before everyone in them woke up and started having opinions. The article was thorough in its inaccuracy. It described her as acting unilaterally without ICW sanction, false, the invocation had been formally acknowledged 48 hours ago. It described Harry as having been seized from his family, the Dursleys were quoted extensively, Vernon having apparently found his voice the moment a reporter appeared on his doorstep. It described the Veela High Council as a continental organization with unclear authority over British subjects. It quoted 2 anonymous ministry sources saying the action was unprecedented and deeply concerning. It quoted Albus Dumbledore. She read Dumbledore's quote twice. "I have every confidence that the Ministry of Magic will address this matter through proper legal channels. The safety and well-being of Harry Potter has always been and remains my primary concern. I urge all parties to exercise patience and restraint while this situation is carefully examined." It was magnificent, she had to admit. Every word was technically true. It communicated, without saying so directly, that she was acting improperly, that the situation was being handled, and that he was the adult in the room. It also positioned him perfectly for whatever happened next. If she succeeded, he'd been urging careful examination. If she failed, he'd urged patience and restraint. She set the paper down and drank her coffee. Seraphine came downstairs at 7:30, read the headline, and said, "Ah," in the tone of someone confirming a prediction they'd made to themselves some time ago. She made coffee and sat down and read the entire article with what appeared to be mild professional interest. "The photograph is actually quite good," she said. "You look formidable. I was trying to get a taxi." Formidable and focused. Seraphine turned a page. "The Dumbledore quote is interesting." "I know. He's not fighting you. He's redirecting you. Creating a narrative where the ministry handles this and you become a loose thread rather than the main event." "I know. Which means he's already spoken to someone in the ministry. Someone he thinks can be repositioned." "Bagnold," Apollon said. "She called last night after I'd gone up." Marguerite took the message. "Bagnold wants another meeting." "She's concerned about the diplomatic implications of the Article 9 action and would like to discuss a collaborative approach. Seraphine sipped her coffee. Meaning Dumbledore called her and she's now looking for a way to make this your problem instead of Britain's. Meaning Dumbledore called her and she's now trying to find a way to slow this down long enough for some of the more embarrassing evidence to become legally complicated. Apollon looked at the window. Diagon Alley outside was waking up. She could hear the sounds of shop owners opening their doors, the distant rumble of delivery carts. I'm not taking that meeting. I'm going to Azkaban instead. Seraphine looked at her over the rim of her coffee cup. Today. This morning. Marguerite is already drafting the access request under Article 9 subsection 7, detained magical persons connected to a minor welfare investigation. We have standing. They can't refuse. She paused. They'll try, but they can't. And if Sirius Black is, Seraphine stopped, choosing her words carefully. Azkaban is not a gentle place. 11 months is a long time. If he's not, then he's not, and we deal with that. Apollon stood. But I am not leaving a man who should have been Harry's guardian rotting in a soul-eating prison while I wait for Bagnall to find a more convenient version of what happened. From upstairs came the sound of small footsteps, slightly uneven, the particular rhythm of a toddler navigating an unfamiliar floor. Then silence. Then, after a moment, a door opening. Harry appeared at the top of the stairs, rabbit tucked under one arm, looking down at the two of them in the morning kitchen light with those careful eyes. He had pillow creases on one cheek. His hair was doing something architectural. Hungry? Apollon called up to him. A pause. Then he came down the stairs one step at a time, holding the banister with his free hand, taking them with complete seriousness. He sat at the kitchen table. Seraphine put bread and butter and a small pot of jam in front of him without ceremony, which seemed to be the right approach. Harry didn't want fuss, she'd noticed. He wanted to be fed and left to watch, which was a set of preferences Apollon found she respected enormously. You're going to Azkaban this morning, Seraphine said to Apollon, in French, once Harry was occupied with his bread. Yes. I'll stay with the boy. Apollon looked at her. Seraphine returned the look with the expression of someone who had raised 3 children and 8 grandchildren and found the prospect of one quiet toddler reasonably manageable. He understands more than he lets on, Apollon said. I know. Seraphine glanced at Harry, who was carefully spreading jam in the specific corner of his bread he had decided deserved jam. He's watching everything. He's been doing the analysis since you picked him up. He'll be fine. She paused. Go get his godfather. The boat to Azkaban took 40 minutes from the mainland, crossing water that was grey and cold and choppy in the way that suggested the sea was also objecting to the prison's existence. The guards were ministry issue, 2 of them, one older with an expression of permanent bureaucratic resignation, one younger who kept glancing at Apollon sideways with the look of someone who had read the prophet that morning and wasn't sure what he was transporting. She'd brought Beaumont, the legal advocate from the council, and a healer named Dr. Pascal Renard who she'd called from Paris overnight and who had arrived at 6 in the morning with a medical case and the brisk, unsentimental manner of someone used to being called at short notice for things that were going to be bad. The island itself was everything its reputation suggested, a jagged, salt-eaten rock in a cold sea, with a structure on it that appeared to have been designed by someone who wanted architecture to feel like a punishment. The guards on the dock were different from the boat guards, bigger, quieter, with the slightly blurred look around the eyes that came from proximity to Dementors. She had the paperwork. ICW Article 9, subsection 7, correctly filed and acknowledged. Beaumont carried it. He was the kind of lawyer whose entire bearing said try to obstruct this and see what happens, which was why she'd brought him. They tried to obstruct it. The warden was a man named Dokes who had the personality of a firmly closed door. He looked at the paperwork, read it slowly, looked at Apollon, and said that he would need to consult with the ministry before allowing access. The paperwork is self-authorizing under the treaty, Beaumont said pleasantly. Consultation with the ministry is not required. It's listed on page 3, paragraph 2. Would you like me to read it to you? I understand what it says. Then you understand that we can enter now, or I can file an obstruction notice with the ICW Compliance Office which will trigger an automatic audit of this facility's treaty compliance record going back 5 years. Beaumont smiled the smile of a man who genuinely enjoyed this part of his job. I would suggest the first option is better for everyone. They went in. The Dementors were the worst part. Not because they were unexpected, she'd encountered them before, at a distance, at magical security conferences where they were discussed in the abstract language of policy. Up close, in the corridors of Azkaban, they were different. They moved like the physical embodiment of despair, and the cold they brought wasn't weather cold but something more interior, more precise, cold that knew exactly which memories to reach for. She cast her Patronus without breaking stride, a large falcon made of golden truth fire rather than silver, which made the younger boat guard stare, and it flew ahead of them down the corridor and the Dementors drifted back. Sirius Black was in cell 47. She heard him before she saw him. Not words, just laughter. Low, intermittent, the kind of laughter that had stopped meaning amusement some time ago and was just a sound the person made because their mind had needed somewhere to go and had gone there. Renard's face tightened when he heard it. The cell door opened. Sirius Black was 32 years old. He looked 20 years older than that, or younger, depending on the angle. The Dementors had taken time from him in a non-linear way, hollowing some parts of his face and leaving other parts frozen at the moment of his arrival. He was sitting on the floor of the cell with his back against the wall and his knees pulled up and his dark eyes pointed at the opposite wall, and when the door opened he turned toward it with the particular slowness of someone who had largely stopped expecting anything to happen. He looked at Apollon. She looked at him. "Sirius Black," she said. He blinked. Something moved across his face, a scrambling, disoriented thing, like a man surfacing from deep water and not being sure which direction was up. "You're real," he said. His voice was rough from disuse. "You're actually real." "Yes. Not a Dementor thing." He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes briefly, then lowered them. "I've had a lot of those." "Not a Dementor thing," she confirmed. "My name is Apollon Delacour. I'm the Veela Matriarch. I'm here because of your godson." The change was immediate and total. Whatever the 11 months had done to Sirius Black, whatever the Dementors had taken or blurred or eaten away at, the word godson landed in him like a key in a lock and the person behind it came present all at once, still damaged, still rough at the edges, but there. "Harry," he said. "Is he? He's alive and he's safe and he's currently eating jam on bread at a table in Diagon Alley," Apollon said. "He's with my colleague. He has a stuffed rabbit." Sirius made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite something else. "James gave him that rabbit," he said. "On his first birthday." His voice cracked on the last word, clean as a branch in cold weather, and he didn't try to fix it. Renard moved past Apollon and crouched in front of Sirius with professional efficiency. "I'm going to assess you. Tell me if anything hurts." "Everything hurts," Sirius said, but it was less complaint than simple information delivery. "Right. Let's be more specific." While Renard worked, Apollon looked around the cell. It was small and cold and bare except for a scratched-in mark on one wall that she looked at and then looked away from because whatever it was, count, mantra, something else, it was private and not hers to read. "What happened?" Sirius asked, while Renard checked his eyes. "To Harry. What happened that you're here?" She told him. Concisely, factually, the way she'd learned to deliver bad news, clearly and without softening, because softening bad news only deferred the impact rather than reducing it. She told him about the scan. The compounds. The cupboard. The charmed owl. The conspiracy's shape, as they currently understood it. Sirius was very still while she spoke. Renard had to remind him twice to breathe evenly. When she finished, Sirius said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, I should have fought harder to stay out. I should have, you had no trial, Apollon said. You were placed here by people who needed you out of the way. There was nothing to fight. Peter, he stopped. Collected himself. Peter Pettigrew. He's the secret keeper. Not me. I was the decoy. We switched at the last moment because I thought, he pressed his jaw. It doesn't matter what I thought. He sold them to Voldemort and he killed 12 people and framed me for it, and he's been free for 11 months. She had been writing notes. She wrote down the name. I need you to make a formal statement, she said. Everything. The secret keeper arrangement, the switch, everything you know about Pettigrew. Beaumont will take it, he's an ICW certified legal witness. This statement becomes part of the Article 9 investigation record, which means it has treaty protection. No one can suppress it or reclassify it. Sirius looked at her. His dark eyes, she noticed, were actually quite sharp behind all the damage. There was a mind there that the Dementors hadn't managed to reach entirely, which said something about the quality of what was inside it. You're moving fast, he said. Yes. Why? Because every day I wait is another day the people responsible have to adjust their positions, move their evidence, and prepare their defenses. She looked at him steadily. And because there's a 2-year-old boy who should have had his godfather and didn't, and I don't see any good reason to let that continue longer than necessary. Sirius stared at her for a long moment. All right, he said. Let's do the statement. She was back in Diagon Alley by 1 in the afternoon. Sirius was with her. Renard had cleared him for transfer on the condition of immediate medical attention, which they were arranging through a private healer in the Enchanted Quarter. He walked with the careful deliberateness of someone relearning that walking was a thing they could do freely, and he looked at the bustle of Diagon Alley as though it were slightly unreal, the way all ordinary things looked unreal after a long time without them. Harry was in the front room of Le Quartier Enchanté, on the floor, doing something complicated with a set of blocks that Seraphine had apparently conjured. Seraphine was reading. There was a 4th cup of tea on the table, recently made, as though she'd heard them coming. Sirius stopped in the doorway. Harry looked up from his blocks. He looked at Sirius the way he looked at everything, carefully, reading, filing. His head tilted slightly. Sirius crouched down, slowly, like a man making himself small so as not to frighten something. His voice when he spoke was very soft and a little wrecked. Hey, pup, he said. Harry looked at him for a long, considering moment. Then he picked up one of his blocks, a red one, and held it out. Sirius took it with both hands, like it was important. Because it was. Seraphine turned a page of her book and said nothing, and her saying nothing was the kindest thing she could have done. The formal ICW acknowledgement arrived by official owl at 3 o'clock. Apollon read it in her room upstairs, standing at the window with the alley below her doing its afternoon business. The acknowledgement was positive. The ICW had confirmed the Article 9 invocation, confirmed Veela legal standing in the investigation, and assigned an observer, an ICW magistrate named Croisier who would arrive Friday to oversee the formal proceedings. This was expected and good. What was not expected was the second document attached to the acknowledgement. A counterfiling. It had come through the British Ministry, fast enough that someone must have had it prepared and waiting. It argued that Article 9 did not apply to the Potter case on 3 grounds. First, that the alleged compounds had not been independently verified by ICW-certified analysts. Second, that the Veela Charter's definition of deliberate contamination required proof of intent which had not been established. And third, and most remarkably, that Harry Potter as the subject of a classified ministry security matter could not be the subject of a foreign welfare investigation without the ministers. Explicit consent. The last ground was creative. It wasn't legal, the treaty was absolutely clear on this, but it was creative. It would require response, and response would take time, and time was the resource they were trying to spend on the other side of the board. She knew, without needing to trace it directly, who had drafted it. The language was specific and precise and arranged in the particular way of someone who was very good at law and was using that goodness in the service of delay. She went downstairs. Beaumont was at the table reviewing his copy of the counter-filing with the focused displeasure of someone reading a document that is technically wrong but annoyingly constructed. "It's Crouch," he said without looking up. "The third ground is entirely his style. He's good." "He is good," Apollon agreed. "Draft our response. Focus on the certification grounds first. Fontaine's credentials are impeccable and we can shut that down in 2 paragraphs. The intent question is more interesting. What do we need for intent? Pattern evidence. Repetition across time. We have that. The dating of the compound layers establishes sustained and repeated action, not accident. I can build that argument." He looked up. "The third ground is bad faith and the ICW magistrate will likely dismiss it on sight, but it creates noise." "Let it create noise," Apollon said. "While they're making noise about Harry, we're building the case about Sirius. The wrongful imprisonment filing goes to the ICW tribunal today, not tomorrow." "Today?" "I thought, today." She looked at him. "I want 2 simultaneous proceedings. The child welfare investigation and the unlawful imprisonment case. I want the ministry handling 2 fires instead of 1. I want Crouch's legal team split. And I want Dumbledore, who has been positioning himself as the responsible adult in the room, to have to explain both publicly." Beaumont looked at her with the professional admiration of someone who appreciated good strategy. "The wrongful imprisonment filing will be contested aggressively." "Yes. But the evidence is Sirius's testimony, the trial records, which don't exist, which is itself evidence, and the statement Dumbledore gave me this morning in which he explicitly said placing Sirius in Azkaban without trial was wrong. He said the word. Beaumont, I have 2 witnesses who heard him use the word wrong." Beaumont smiled slowly. "I'll have the filing ready in an hour." The response from the British side came faster than she'd expected, and it didn't come through legal channels. It came through the front door. She was upstairs reviewing Fontaine's completed analysis, the full compound catalogue, 47 pages of forensic potions documentation that was, objectively speaking, one of the most damning pieces of evidence she'd ever seen assembled in a single document, when Marguerite knocked and opened the door. "There's a woman downstairs asking to see you," Marguerite said. She came alone. "She's not ministry," she identified herself as Amelia Bones, head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement's Special Investigation Division. Apollon put the analysis down. "Not Crouch's department." "No. She said specifically that she's not here in any official capacity. She came through the front door of the alley, no ministry escort, paid for her own tea downstairs." Marguerite paused. "She said she read the Prophet this morning and she'd like 5 minutes." Apollon came downstairs. Amelia Bones was a solidly built woman in her early 50s with a monocle in her left eye that she clearly found useful and had long since stopped caring whether it looked eccentric. She was drinking the tea she'd apparently paid for and looking around the room with the observant calm of someone who spent most of their professional life reading environments. She looked at Apollon and said, without preamble, "The Prophet piece was Lucius Malfoy." Apollon sat down across from her. "How do you know?" "Because the photographer who took that picture of you works for a studio that's been receiving payments from a Gringotts account registered to a shell company that Malfoy's legal team set up in 1980. I've been watching that account for 2 years. Nothing to do with you, I've been watching it because of other things." She set down her tea. "Malfoy doesn't care about Harry Potter. He cares about chaos. Your investigation creates chaos for Dumbledore, yes, but it also creates chaos for the Ministry, and chaos in the Ministry is a resource for people like Malfoy." She paused. "He's going to try to use you." "Use me how?" "He'll support you publicly while privately feeding information to whoever in the Ministry can benefit from Dumbledore's fall. He wants the power vacuum. He's been positioning for it since Voldemort fell. If your investigation takes down Dumbledore and destabilizes the Ministry simultaneously, Malfoy ends up the most powerful figure in a reorganized Wizengamot. She said it all with the flat, factual delivery of a woman who had long since made her peace with how bad people got to where they were. I'm telling you this because I don't want to see your legitimate case turned into someone else's lever. Apollon studied her. Why are you telling me anything? You came here alone and off record. Because I've been trying to build a case against the corruption in this ministry for 3 years, and every time I get close someone moves something. Bones' jaw tightened briefly. Because I read your documentation summary, yes, someone gave me a copy, and yes, I know that's interesting, and I've never seen anything that thorough or that airtight. And because, she stopped, and something crossed her face that was more personal than the rest of it, I had a nephew. Edgar. He was in the Order. He was killed in 1980. After he died, I started asking questions about how certain Death Eaters knew things they should not have known about Order movements. I never got satisfying answers. She looked at Apollon directly. I think the corruption in this ministry is older and deeper than your investigation currently suspects. And I think you're the first person in 11 years who might actually be in a position to do something about it. Apollon was quiet for a moment. Then, what do you want in return? Bones didn't hesitate. Access to your evidence. Not to use, not to take, to read. I want to see the full compound analysis. I want the names of the sources. And I want, she paused, I want the trial records for Sirius Black. There are no trial records for Sirius Black. Bones's expression didn't change. I know. You know there are no records and you're not surprised. I've been not surprised about it for 11 months. I just couldn't do anything about it because every avenue I tried was closed before I got there. She looked at her hands briefly, then back up. Give me what you can. I'll give you what I have. And I'll be the honest ministry contact you need, because you're going to need one. The alternative is working entirely through Bagnold, and Bagnold is managed, Apollon said. Managed, Bones agreed. That evening, Lucius Malfoy sent flowers. An enormous arrangement, white and extravagant, with a handwritten card that called her a champion of justice in these troubled times and invited her to dinner at Malfoy Manor. The card was written in a beautiful hand and smelled, faintly, of something expensive. Marguerite looked at the flowers with profound skepticism. He moves fast, she said. He was moving before I arrived, Apollon said. She turned the card over, looking at the back. Nothing written there. He's been watching this situation since Tuesday and he's made his calculation. He thinks I'm a useful tool. Are you going to dinner? No. She set the card down. Send back the flowers with a polite note. Say I'm too occupied with the investigation to accept social engagements. She paused. But don't close the door entirely. If he thinks I might come around, he'll stay interested, and a Lucius Malfoy who is interested in your investigation is more useful than one who has decided you're his enemy. You're going to run him alongside Bones, Marguerite said, with a note of professional appreciation. Let him think he's using you while you use the fact that he's trying. I'm going to let him believe his support is welcome and then document every attempt he makes to redirect the investigation, and add it to the pile. Apollon moved to the window. Outside, Diagon Alley was settling into evening, the shops closing one by one, the lampposts coming on with their warm magical light. We have 3 days before the ICW magistrate arrives. Before Friday I need Fontaine's full analysis finalized and certified, Sirius's wrongful imprisonment filing in front of the tribunal, Bones's documentation of ministry corruption formally attached to our investigation record, and a complete list of every compound source we've identified. That's a lot for 3 days. Yes. She watched a family walk past below the window, parents and 2 children, the smaller one being carried, head against a parent's shoulder with the boneless ease of a child nearly asleep. Marguerite. The third compound source. Snape. Marguerite's expression did something careful. We haven't confirmed it yet. Dumbledore named him as the most likely source. Fontaine agrees the compositional signature is consistent with someone at his level. He's currently teaching at Hogwarts, which means he has access to an advanced laboratory, an unlimited potion supply chain, and the authority to receive and send owls without scrutiny. She turned from the window. I want eyes on Hogwarts. The school is warded against, I know what it's warded against. I'm not trying to breach the wards. I want observation of owl traffic in and out of the school. I want a check on the potion supply orders going back to September 1981. And I want Dumbledore, who has agreed, in front of witnesses, to full cooperation, to formally provide us with access to the Hogwarts potion stores for comparison against the compound signatures. She looked at Marguerite steadily. He agreed to cooperate. Hold him to it. Marguerite was already writing. From across the building came the sound of Sirius's low voice. He'd been talking to Harry for the last hour, an ongoing, quiet murmur that she couldn't quite make out but that had been continuous and apparently welcome. Harry had not moved away from it, which was saying something for a child who had been taught, at a cellular level, to wait and watch and not commit. Seraphine appeared in the doorway of the main room with an empty wine glass and a look of quiet satisfaction. The boy laughed, she said. Apollon looked up. About 20 minutes ago, Seraphine said. Black was doing something with his hands, some kind of shape, a shadow puppet on the wall. Harry laughed. She looked at the empty glass. It was a very good sound. Apollon said nothing. She turned back to the window and looked at the evening settling over Diagon Alley, at the lampposts and the last few shoppers and the ordinary, oblivious magic of it, and she thought about what Fontaine had said about the third compound source. About engineering a child to choose death willingly. About making self-sacrifice not a virtue but a mechanism. She thought about what it meant that someone had done that to a child who was currently laughing at shadow puppets and didn't know what had been built inside him. The truth fire in her chest had found a new note. Not cold, not hot, something that moved differently from both. Something that was beginning to understand the more actions right the next chapter now. Chapter 4, Fire and Foundation. The ICW magistrate arrived on Friday morning in a manner that suggested he took himself very seriously. Edouard Croisier was 68, Swiss-French, with silver hair swept back from a broad forehead and the bearing of a man who had presided over 17 international magical disputes and found all of them somewhat beneath his capabilities. He arrived at Le Quartier Enchanté with 2 clerks and a personal aide and an expression that communicated, without hostility, that he intended to be entirely in charge of whatever room he walked into. He walked into Apollon's room and found her already at the table with Beaumont and Fontaine and the full documentation spread across 3 feet of hardwood surface, and she looked up at him and said, "Good morning, magistrate. Sit wherever you like. We're starting with the compound analysis." He sat. His expression adjusted slightly, the way a compass needle adjusts when it finds north isn't quite where it expected. The next 4 hours were dense and technical, and Apollon found them, honestly, invigorating. This was the work, not the political maneuvering or the press management or the careful calibration of which adversary to engage and how, but this, the actual forensic truth laid out on a table, piece by piece, each compound dated and sourced and cross-referenced, each layer of the conspiracy visible in the accumulated weight of evidence. Fontaine presented with the crisp authority of a scientist who knew her findings were unassailable and didn't need to oversell them. Beaumont handled the legal framing. Apollon filled in the investigative narrative. Croisier asked good questions. She appreciated that. He pushed on the dating methodology, on the chain of custody for the charmed owl, on the legal basis for identifying compound sources from compositional analysis alone without a direct confession. These were legitimate challenges and she had legitimate answers, and the process of question and answer built the record in the way a good cross-examination built a record, not undermining the case but reinforcing its architecture by testing it. By noon, Croisier had removed his jacket, which meant he'd stopped performing and started working. That was a good sign. The wrongful imprisonment filing, he said, over a lunch that someone had brought up from the kitchen downstairs. You filed it simultaneously with the welfare investigation. Yes. That's unusual. Typically a secondary matter. It's not a secondary matter, Apollon said. Sirius Black is Harry Potter's legal guardian under the Potter's will. He was removed from that position not by any legal mechanism but by being placed in prison without trial. The two cases are structurally connected. You can't fully assess who has been making decisions about Harry Potter's welfare without understanding that the person designated to make those decisions was deliberately sidelined. Courvoisier turned his fork over in his hand. Deliberately is a strong word. The absence of a trial is not an oversight, Apollon said. A trial was not conducted, not forgotten. The ministry records show no scheduling of a hearing, no filing of charges, no appointment of legal counsel. For 11 months. In a country with a functioning legal infrastructure. She looked at him steadily. Someone decided a trial should not happen. That is a decision, not an absence. He ate his lunch and thought about this. Then, I'd like to interview Black this afternoon. He's available. He's in better shape than he was 3 days ago. Renard has been working with him. Physically he's recovering. Mentally, she paused, he's functional. He's angry, which is healthy, and he's focused on his godson, which gives him something external to organize around. I'd say he'll interview well. And the child? I'll need to, tomorrow morning, Apollon said. I want Renard there when you assess Harry. Not because I don't trust the process but because Harry doesn't know you and I'd like someone familiar to him present. Standard procedure, Courvoisier agreed. He looked at the documentation spread across the table, at 47 pages of forensic analysis and the secondary files and the letters and the ministry records. He looked at it with the expression of a man who had handled 17 international magical disputes and was recalibrating his sense of what a significant case looked like. Matriarch Delacour. In your professional judgment, and I'm asking for judgment, not legal argument, how high does this go? She met his eyes. I think the conspiracy has at least 4 distinct nodes. Slughorn as the original architect, motivated by collection, he was building future influence in talented magical bloodlines. Dumbledore as the manager, motivated by what he genuinely believes is the greater good, which makes him the most dangerous because his motives are the most defensible. Molly Weasley as an instrument, someone who was told a story that made her actions feel like love rather than violation. And a fourth source that we've tentatively identified as Severus Snape, whose motives are currently the least clear to me and therefore the most concerning. She paused. And Lucius Malfoy orbiting the outside of it, not as a conspirator in the potion's sense but as someone who has known enough for long enough and chosen silence as his contribution. Courvoisier was quiet. There may be more nodes, she said. That's what worries me most. We've traced the compounds we know about. But whoever designed that suppression ward, the one drawing power from Harry's distress, that's a level of magical engineering that isn't any of the 4 sources I just named. That's someone else. Someone I haven't found yet. Sirius interviewed well. He sat across from Courvoisier in the small meeting room on the 2nd floor and gave his testimony with a clarity that Apollon suspected had been building for 11 months, everything he'd wanted to say, organized by the particular discipline of having had nothing to do but think. He was still too thin, still rough at the edges, still occasionally lost his thread when something touched a specific memory and had to find his way back. But the core of what he said was precise and consistent and devastating. He described the secret keeper arrangement. The switch from him to Pettigrew. The reasons for the switch, the suspicion, which he discussed with James, that someone close to them was feeding information to Voldemort, and the decision that making Sirius the decoy would expose any informant who came looking. The night of the 31st of October. Finding the house. Finding James. Finding Lily. Not finding Harry, and the frantic minutes before someone told him Hagrid had the boy. He described confronting Pettigrew. The explosion. The 12 bodies. The laughter. Why were you laughing? Courvoisier asked. Sirius looked at the table for a moment. Because I'd been outplayed so completely that it was either laugh or do something worse. Because Peter had taken everything, James, Lily, the chance to take Harry, my freedom, in one move, and there was something in it that was almost, not admirable, but total. The way a catastrophe is total. He looked up. I wasn't laughing because I'd done anything. I was laughing because I understood, right then, that I hadn't. That I'd been exactly the fool he needed me to be. He paused. Then the Aurors arrived and I was still laughing and I never got to stop because no one ever asked me to explain. Courvoisier made a note. You were transported to Azkaban directly from the scene. Without being asked a single question, Sirius said. Not one. They bound me, they transported me, they put me in a cell. The only time anyone spoke to me officially was when the warden read me the charges, not in a courtroom, in my cell, and told me I'd be held indefinitely pending a tribunal that never came. He looked at Courvoisier with his dark eyes that were still sharp behind everything the prison had done. I've had a lot of time to think about why. Why no trial? The only answer that makes sense is that a trial would have required me to speak, and speaking would have produced questions, and questions would have led to Pettigrew, and Pettigrew was being protected by someone who needed the story to stay exactly as it was. Who do you think that someone is? Courvoisier asked. Sirius was quiet for a moment. I think the easier answer is that it was just chaos, that no one in the ministry was thinking clearly in the immediate aftermath of the war ending, and the paperwork fell through the cracks. I think that answer is wrong. He looked at the table. Dumbledore knew about the secret keeper arrangement. I told him, 2 days before we switched, that we were going to move the keeper. I didn't tell him who the new one was, that was the point, but he knew the arrangement existed. If anyone was going to ask questions at the scene, it was him. He paused. He didn't ask questions. The room was quiet. He needed me out of the way, Sirius said, not with bitterness but with the tired precision of a conclusion reached through long examination. Not because I'd done anything. But because I'd asked questions he didn't want asked, about where Harry was going, about who was making decisions, about the will. James made me godfather specifically because he didn't trust institutions with his son. Dumbledore knew that. He looked up. I think he let the chaos make the decision for him and then didn't correct it. Harry's magic announced itself Saturday morning at 7:43. No one asked it to. Apollon was in the kitchen when she heard it, a sound like a large bell struck once, resonant and clear, coming from upstairs. She was halfway up the stairs before it finished reverberating. Harry was sitting up in his bed looking at the ceiling with an expression of calm surprise. Around him, every object in the room, the block Seraphine had conjured, a cup of water on the side table, 3 of Sirius's shoes that had wandered in from the hallway, a small decorative mirror, was floating at roughly chest height, rotating slowly in the same direction, as though orbiting something only Harry could see. Fontaine appeared behind Apollon in the doorway. She ran a quick scan without being asked. The suppression is wearing off, Fontaine said quietly. The ward degraded when we removed him from Privet Drive, it needed the anchor location. He's been suppressed for so long that his core it's recalibrating. Finding its own level. A pause. His level is very high. I can see that, Apollon said. Harry looked down from the ceiling and found her in the doorway. He pointed up at the floating objects with complete seriousness, as though she might not have noticed. Yes, she said. I see. He pointed at the cup of water. It drifted toward him obediently. He took it and drank, and the other objects slowly lowered back to their surfaces, slightly rearranged from where they'd started. Sirius appeared from down the hall still half asleep, registered the scene, and leaned against the doorframe with an expression that was the most unguarded she'd seen from him yet, not surprised, not alarmed. Something closer to recognition. James used to do something like that when he was stressed, he said. Things would just orbit. Harry isn't stressed, Fontaine observed. No, Sirius agreed, watching his godson examine the cup with focused interest. He's just waking up. This is going to become more significant, Fontaine said to Apollon, low enough for just them. As the suppression fully clears, which could take weeks, it's been in place his whole life, we're going to see more of this. Bigger expressions. Less control, not because he's reckless but because the control was never developed. He was never allowed to develop it. Then we help him develop it. Veela tutoring methods aren't designed for, then we adapt them. Apollon watched Harry put the cup back with careful precision, exactly in the ring it had left on the side table. 2 years old, she thought. Chains on his soul for his entire conscious life, and this is what survived. He doesn't need to be managed or contained. He needs to be taught. The assessment with Courvoisier went better than expected. Harry sat on Apollon's lap throughout, which he'd started doing with a casualness that she'd decided to simply accept as the rational decision of a child who had identified her as safe and was acting accordingly. He watched Courvoisier with his standard careful attention, answered the simple questions the magistrate put to him, his name, his age, things he liked, things he didn't, with complete composure, and at one point reached out and touched Courvoisier's monocle with an expression of philosophical curiosity that made the magistrate blink. Extraordinary child, Courvoisier said afterward, when Harry had gone off with Sirius. Yes. The magic reading is, I've never seen a suppression recovery that active in a subject this young. It's almost aggressive. It's been caged, Apollon said. Now it isn't. Courvoisier was quiet for a moment. I'm going to recommend to the full ICW tribunal that both cases proceed simultaneously. The welfare investigation and the wrongful imprisonment. The documentary evidence is sufficient to move to formal hearings. He looked at her. I'm also going to recommend that Harry Potter remain in Veela Council custody for the duration of proceedings, with Sirius Black as co-guardian pending the outcome of his case. The alternative, returning him to the Dursleys or placing him in ministry care, is untenable given the ministry's compromised position. Agreed. Dumbledore will challenge the custody arrangement. He'll try, Apollon said. His legal standing to do so is questionable at best. He's not a family member, he's not named in the will, and his own statement to me, on record, witnessed, acknowledges he placed the child in an inadequate situation. That's not a strong position from which to argue for guardianship. Courvoisier made a note. Then he looked up. The fourth source. The unidentified architect of the suppression ward. Still working on it. It troubles me more than the others, he said. The potions conspiracy is terrible. But a suppression ward of that sophistication, drawing power from a child's distress, placed and maintained over 2 years, he shook his head, that's not a side project. Whoever built that ward put significant time and power into it. It has a purpose beyond what the potions conspiracy requires. I know, Apollon said. It's a containment mechanism. Separate from the loyalty conditioning. Someone wanted him loyal and manageable, that's the potions. But someone else wanted him small. Wanted his power reduced and his development arrested. She looked at the window. 2 different goals. 2 different architects. Which means the conspiracy isn't as unified as it looks. Competing interests, Courvoisier said. Competing interests using the same child as their resource. She turned from the window. Which means at some point, those interests are going to come into conflict. And when they do, the conflict will tell us more about who's involved than any amount of forensic analysis. The conflict came sooner than she'd expected. It came on Sunday afternoon, in the form of Lucius Malfoy walking through the front door of Le Quartier Enchanté without an appointment and with the air of a man who considered announcement an optional social grace. He was immaculate, as always. Silver blonde hair, dark robes that cost more than most wizards made in a year, the elegant walking stick that everyone in magical Britain knew wasn't just a walking stick. He looked around the room with the particular quality of someone appraising real estate and said, to the room in general, I apologize for the intrusion. I have information I think the matriarch will want. Apollon was at the table with Bones, who had been coming in through the back twice a day and who looked at Malfoy with the flat professional assessment of someone who had been building a file on him for years. "Mr. Malfoy," Apollon said. "I thought we agreed on a polite note declining dinner." "We did. This isn't dinner." He looked at Bones and something moved across his face, not surprise, exactly, but the recalibration of a man updating his map. "Amelia. Interesting. Lucius," Bones said, with the precise minimum of syllables. He crossed the room and sat in the empty chair at the table as though he'd been invited, folding his hands over the top of his cane with the ease of a man who was never uncomfortable anywhere. "I have information about the suppression ward," he said to Apollon. The room was very still. "The architectural signature," he said. "You've been looking for the source." "I know who built it." Apollon looked at him. "And you're telling me because?" "Because the person who built it also built several structures I've been trying to disentangle myself from for the last year, and their continued freedom represents a significant personal inconvenience to me." He said it with perfect smoothness, as though personal inconvenience was a reasonable thing to invade someone's workplace over. "We have mutual interests." "We don't have mutual interests," Apollon said. "You have interests that happen to currently align with mine. There's a significant difference." He smiled. "As you like. The name is Bellatrix Lestrange." Bones's expression didn't change. Apollon's didn't either. "Lestrange is in Azkaban," Bones said. "Yes. She is. But the ward on Privet Drive was placed in October 1981, before her arrest. She had a week between Voldemort's fall and her capture. Based on what I know of her capabilities and her particular obsessions, she would have been one of the only people in Britain capable of building a suppression ward that sophisticated, that quickly." He looked at Apollon. "She's also a Bellatrix, which means she didn't build it independently. She built it for someone who asked her to. Someone she would have done anything for. Which narrows the field considerably." "You're saying Voldemort ordered the suppression ward," Apollon said. "I'm saying someone who Bellatrix served ordered it. If that was Voldemort, and given the timing, then the ward predates the potions conspiracy. It predates Dumbledore's plans. It's the oldest layer." He tilted his head slightly. "Which means someone was planning for the possibility of Harry Potter's survival before Harry Potter had survived." The table was very quiet. Fontaine had come in from the side room and was listening from the doorway. Beaumont had his quill poised above parchment. "A contingency," Apollon said. "In case the killing curse failed." "In case the boy lived," Malfoy said. "Someone, perhaps Voldemort himself or someone acting in his interests, placed the suppression ward the moment it became clear the child had survived. The intent was to keep his power down. Keep him small and controllable and damaged, not just manageable, but genuinely diminished. So that if Voldemort ever returned, he spread one hand, the great obstacle would be considerably smaller than advertised. And the potions conspiracy," Bones said slowly, "was layered on top of that. Different architects, different goals, but all converging on the same result. A Harry Potter who was suppressed in power, loyal on command, and predisposed to self-sacrifice. A perfect weapon," Apollon said. "Or a perfect victim. Depending on who was using him." Malfoy looked at her with something that was not quite respect but was adjacent to it. "I want full immunity for my testimony in the tribunal proceedings," he said. "Whatever I know about the inner workings of the Death Eater network as it relates to this case, I will testify to. In exchange for immunity." "I don't grant immunity," Apollon said. "The ICW tribunal determines that." "Then I want your personal recommendation to the tribunal." She looked at him for a long moment. "Give me everything on Bellatrix Lestrange and the suppression ward. Every detail, every corroboration you can provide. Then we'll discuss what my recommendation looks like." He nodded, once, the nod of a man completing a transaction. He stood. "There's one more thing." "There always is." Pettigrew, he said. Peter Pettigrew. He's alive. Bones was out of her chair before she'd consciously decided to stand. Where, she said, and her voice had dropped a register. I don't know currently. But I know he's alive because I received a communication from him in September of last year, seeking protection. I declined. He was in rat form at the time, which is how he's been surviving. He picked up his cane. He'll attach himself to someone. Someone prominent enough to provide cover. He was always very good at finding useful people. He looked at Apollon. That information is provided freely, without negotiation. Consider it a show of good faith. He left the way he'd come, through the front door, without being escorted out. Bones was already moving toward the window, watching him go with that flat professional gaze. I need to brief my team, she said. Do it quietly, Apollon said. If Pettigrew knows we're looking, he'll go deeper. I know how to run a manhunt. Bones turned from the window. You know Malfoy's playing his own game. I know. He doesn't actually care about Harry Potter. I know that too. Apollon looked at the chair Malfoy had vacated. But the information about Lestrange and Pettigrew doesn't become less true because the person who delivered it has a self-serving motive. We verify everything he gave us and we use what's accurate. That's all. Sunday night, she found Sirius and Harry in the small courtyard at the back of the building. It was past 9, later than Harry should have been up, but no one had been keeping rigid schedules and Apollon had decided that routine was going to have to wait until Harry had a more stable permanent arrangement. They were sitting on the back step, Sirius with his back against the doorframe and Harry between his knees, and Sirius was pointing up at the sky over the narrow strip of Diagon Alley's rooftops, identifying stars. That one, Sirius was saying, pointing at a bright point above the chimney line. Harry looked up with full concentration. That's Sirius, Sirius said, with the particular quality of a man who had made this joke before, to someone who was no longer here. The dog star. Brightest star in the night sky. Harry looked at the star. Then he looked at Sirius. Your name, he said. Yeah. Sirius's voice was very even. My family named all their kids after stars. Tradition. He paused. Your dad used to tell me I should be grateful I didn't end up as Bellatrix. What's that one? Harry pointed at another star. That's Regulus. Something tightened in Sirius's voice briefly and then released. My brother. He stopped. He made some bad choices and then made one very good one at the end. I don't know if it balanced out. I hope it did. Harry looked at the star for a long moment. Then he leaned back against Sirius's chest with the unself-conscious trust of a child who had decided, completely and without reservation, that this was safe. Sirius's arm came around him automatically. Apollon stood in the doorway and didn't announce herself. She looked at the two of them against the night sky, the man who had lost everything and the child who had never had it to begin with, and she thought about what the tribunal was going to look like and what the next week would bring and how many more threads were still to pull. After a while Harry's head dropped to one side and his breathing deepened. Sirius looked down at him. He looked at him for a long time without saying anything. Then he looked up and found Apollon in the doorway and his expression was the most unguarded she'd seen from him yet, not the sharp anger or the careful testimony or the deliberate functioning. Just a man holding his godson in a back courtyard under stars that had his brother's name on them, trying to figure out how to hold the weight of everything simultaneously. The tribunal, he said quietly. What do you actually think happens? I think the evidence is strong enough to convict on the wrongful imprisonment, she said, equally quiet. The welfare case is more complicated. Establishing criminal intent from compound analysis requires the tribunal to accept forensic methodology that some members will resist. But the pattern evidence is compelling and Fontaine is extraordinarily credible. And Dumbledore? She thought about this honestly. I think Dumbledore loses his ICW positions. I think he faces significant professional consequences. She paused, I think what he actually believed about what he was doing is genuinely complicated, which will be both his defense and his punishment. He'll live with knowing that the story he told himself didn't survive contact with what actually happened. Is that enough? Sirius asked. It was a real question. Not rhetorical. No, she said honestly. It's not enough. But it's what the law can do, and then on top of that, you build something different. Something better. She looked at Harry asleep against his godfather's chest. He gets to grow up now. Without the chains. That's not nothing. Sirius looked down at Harry again. Something moved through his face, grief and relief and the specific tenderness of someone who has been given back something they'd stopped letting themselves want. He laughed today, Sirius said. When his magic did the floating thing with the blocks, he thought it was funny. I heard. James used to laugh when his magic surprised him too. Before he learned to control it. He thought it was the best game. He was quiet for a moment. Harry's going to be extraordinary. He already is, Apollon said. She went back inside and left them to the stars. At midnight, Fontaine knocked on her door. I've been running the residual compound analysis, she said. The clearance rate. She had her notebook open and her finger on a specific line. The love potion compounds are clearing. Now that the suppression ward is degraded, his system is processing them. It's going to take months for the full clearance, but the trajectory is, she looked up, Matriarch, his natural emotional responses are already coming through. The compounds operated by suppressing the authentic response and substituting the designed one. As they clear, the authentic responses are emerging. That's good, Apollon said. Yes. But it means that what we're seeing from him right now, the attachment to Black, the trust in you, the way he's been responding to people here, those aren't compound mediated. Those are real. Fontaine closed her notebook. He chose all of it. On his own. A 2-year-old child who was trained his entire short life not to trust anything, and the moment the training started clearing, he looked around and chose. Apollon was quiet. I thought you should know, Fontaine said. Before the tribunal. Before all of it. She paused. Whatever he was designed to be, whatever they built inside him, it didn't take. Not completely. Something in him resisted. She turned to go. I find that remarkable. So do I, Apollon said. She sat alone in her room for a while after Fontaine left, with the truth fire in her chest burning clear and steady, not angry now, or rather, not only angry. Something else alongside the anger. Something that felt like the beginning of being certain that this was worth every piece of the fight. Tomorrow the tribunal date would be set. Tomorrow Dumbledore would respond to the Hogwarts potions access request. Tomorrow Bones would brief her team about Pettigrew and the hunt would begin. She was ready. She blew out the lamp and lay in the dark and listened to the building settle around her and thought, somewhere in the space between wakefulness and sleep, that the most remarkable thing wasn't the 340 chains. It was that something had survived them. Chapter 5, The Burning of Old Maps. The tribunal convened on a Wednesday. Not in the Ministry of Magic. Apollon had argued against that location from the moment the venue question arose, and Courvoisier had agreed with her reasoning without much persuasion. You didn't hold an impartial hearing about ministry corruption inside the ministry building. The ICW had a regional facility in Edinburgh, a solid grey stone building on a hill that had been used for exactly this kind of proceeding 4 times in the last century, and it had the advantage of being on British soil, which mattered symbolically, while being entirely under ICW jurisdiction, which mattered practically. The panel was 5 magistrates. Courvoisier presiding, 2 from continental Europe, 1 from North America, 1 from East Asia. None of them British. None of them French, which had been a concession Apollon had made without being asked, because being seen to stack the panel would have cost more than it gained. She arrived an hour early. She wanted to see the room before anyone else filled it. It was a good room for this kind of work, high windows, oak benches worn smooth by decades of use, a quality of light that was neither warm nor cold but simply clear. Honest light. She stood at the front of it and looked at the empty seats and thought about what the next several days would cost and decided she was ready to pay it. Beaumont came in behind her with 3 cases of documentation. Fontaine was with him, carrying her certified analysis in a sealed evidence container. Marguerite had the secondary files. They arranged everything with the quiet efficiency of people who had been preparing for this for 2 weeks and knew exactly where everything went. At 8:45, the British delegation arrived. Bagnold first, with 2 ministry solicitors and Crouch walking 1 step behind her. Bagnold looked like a woman who had not been sleeping well and had decided to dress as though she had. Her robes were impeccable. Her face was doing the managed news expression again, but it was working harder than it had in their first meeting, showing the effort more. Crouch looked at Apollon across the room with the expression of a man who had spent 2 weeks reading the documentation and had arrived at this room having concluded that the case was strong and wishing, very much, that it were not. Then Dumbledore. He came in with no entourage, no legal team, no documentation cases. Just himself, in deep purple robes, with his half-moon spectacles and his white beard and the quality of presence that filled a room differently from anyone else. Several of the arriving observers, journalists, ministry officials, 2 members of the Wisingamat who had been granted observer status, tracked him with their eyes the way people tracked the most significant thing in their field of vision. He looked at Apollon. She looked at him. He nodded, once. She returned it. That was the entirety of their communication before proceedings began, and it contained within it the compressed weight of everything they'd said in that room at Le Quartier Enchanté, the documentation, the names, the word wrong, the leather notebook, and the specific silence of a man who had decided cooperation was more dignified than resistance. Sirius came in last, with Renard beside him and Bones a step behind. He was in clean robes that Marguerite had arranged, his dark hair pulled back, his face still carrying the marks of 11 months in Azkaban but oriented differently now, not hollowed, not drifting. Present and sharp and aimed at something. He sat on the witness bench. He didn't look at Dumbledore. Apollon noted this and noted equally that Dumbledore looked at Sirius, once, with an expression that was the most unguarded thing she'd seen from him, something that was neither calculation nor performance but simply the face of a man looking at the consequence of a choice he'd lived with. Harry was not in the building. He was at Le Quartier Enchanté with Seraphine and a young advocate named Isabelle who had arrived from Paris on Monday and who Harry had decided was acceptable company, largely on the basis that she'd produced an orange from her bag and peeled it without making it a transaction. Courvoisier called the proceedings to order at 9 o'clock precisely. The first day was documentation. Fontaine presented the compound analysis for 4 hours. She was extraordinary at this, clear, methodical, with the particular authority of someone who had done the work and wasn't asking the panel to take anything on faith. Every claim sourced. Every methodology explained and defensible. When the British solicitor cross-examined her on the dating methodology, she disassembled his challenge in 3 sentences and rebuilt her position in 2 more, and the solicitor sat down with the look of a man who had confirmed what he'd suspected going in. The charmed owl was presented in its evidence container. Fontaine walked the panel through the delivery mechanism, the potion composition, the receiving charm that sent magical output data to a coded destination. The destination, she explained, had been traced to a property in Wiltshire. Crouch, in the observer section, went very still. Beaumont presented the wrongful imprisonment documentation in the afternoon. The absence of trial records was, as he predicted, devastating in its simplicity, not a complex argument but an unanswerable fact. No hearing date. No charge sheet. No appointed counsel. No record of any ministry official ever questioning the decision to bypass due process. 11 months. Documented. He presented the Potter's will. He presented Sirius's designation as godfather and primary guardian. He presented Dumbledore's placement order, with the ministry seal, signed by a deputy clerk who, Beaumont noted precisely, had been on Dumbledore's staff at the Order of the Phoenix and had taken the ministry position 6 months before the Potters' deaths. The panel asked questions. Good ones. Courvoisier had clearly briefed them well. By the time proceedings adjourned at 6, the shape of the case was visible to everyone in the room, laid out in the clear Edinburgh light like a map that had been covering something smaller and darker underneath it. Sirius testified on the second morning. He spoke for 3 hours. He was, Apollon thought, watching from her seat, one of the most compelling witnesses she'd ever seen, and not because he was polished or managed but because he was the opposite. He was entirely unmanaged, present with everything that had happened, neither minimizing nor amplifying. He said what he knew and said when he didn't know something and didn't fill the gaps with inference. Several times he had to stop and collect himself, briefly, and then continued. The panel watched him with the focused attention of people who were reading every layer simultaneously. The cross-examination from the British solicitor was aggressive and not particularly effective. He pushed on Sirius's reliability as a witness given his mental state. Sirius looked at him and said, evenly, "You're welcome to consult Dr. Pascal Renard's assessment of my mental capacity. It's in the documentation. Page 31. He paused. Or you could ask me a substantive question. The observer gallery did something that wasn't quite laughter and wasn't quite murmuring. Then Dumbledore testified. He took the witness seat with the unhurried care of a man who had decided, in the time since their meeting at Le Quartier Enchanté, exactly what kind of witness he was going to be. Not defensive. Not dissembling. He had made a choice about how to enter this moment, and what he'd chosen was something closer to accountability than Apollon had expected. He confirmed the placement order. He confirmed knowledge of the suppression ward's mechanism. He confirmed asking Molly Weasley to provide a loyalty compound. He confirmed not investigating the anomalies in Lily Potter's magical signature. He confirmed knowing about the secret keeper switch and not pursuing it after Sirius's arrest. Each confirmation fell into the room like a stone into still water, and the circle spread. What he also did, and this was the part that was both admirable and infuriating, was explain. Not excuse. Explain. He spoke about the prophecy with a clarity that suggested he'd decided transparency here was worth more than protection. He spoke about Voldemort's potential return, about the 17 years he believed they had before that became real, about the decisions he'd made in the context of a war that wasn't over just because everyone had stopped fighting. You believed, Courvoisier said, that managing Harry Potter's development was necessary for Wizarding Britain's survival. I believed, Dumbledore said, that Harry Potter's survival was necessary for Wizarding Britain's survival. I told myself the methods I chose in service of that survival were regrettable necessities. I understand now, he paused, and the pause had weight, that the methods were not separate from the end I was pursuing. That a child shaped by manipulation and deprivation into a weapon is not the same as a child who chooses, freely, to be brave. I understood this intellectually. I did not live by it. The room was very quiet. I was so certain, he said, and his voice was simply old, that I was the only one who understood the full picture. That certainty cost a great deal. Not me. Them. He looked at his hands. I would like to say that I did not know about the Lestrange ward, about the compounds from Slughorn, about the self-sacrifice engineering. I did not know, and I should have looked harder to find out. The fact that others were pursuing their own agendas with this child, while I was pursuing mine, does not exonerate my agenda. Sirius was looking at Dumbledore now. His face was doing something complicated that had moved beyond anger into something harder to name. Courvoisier asked the question that the room had been building toward for 2 days. Albus Dumbledore. Did you believe that Harry Potter's suffering, at the Dursley house, within the suppression structure, was acceptable as a cost? A long pause. Longer than the others. I told myself it was temporary, Dumbledore said. I told myself the protection was worth the price. Those are not the same as believing it was acceptable. He looked up at the panel. But the result was the same. The third day was when everything broke open. It started ordinarily enough, Fontaine presenting the corroborative analysis of the Hogwarts potion stores, which Dumbledore had provided access to as promised. The comparison with the third compound source was compelling but not yet definitive, pending Snape's own testimony which had been scheduled for the afternoon. What disrupted the morning was a message delivered to Bones at 9:47, which she read, folded, looked at Apollon across the room, and mouthed 2 words. "He's found." Pettigrew. One of Bones's team had located him the previous evening, in rat form, living in the Weasley family home at the Burrow. The Weasley family had a pet rat named Scabbers that the second son, Percy, age 12, had owned for 3 years. The rat had been scanned at Bones's request by a field investigator using a creature identification charm and had come back, animagus, unregistered. Human magical signature, Peter Pettigrew. The implications were immediate and severe and Apollon processed them in about 4 seconds. Pettigrew had been living in the home of the family whose matriarch had been brewing loyalty compounds for Harry Potter at Dumbledore's direction. Whether that was coincidence or design was a question that didn't have a clean answer yet, but it was a question that would need answering. She leaned to Beaumont and spoke in a low, quick voice and he was out of the room in under a minute. The tribunal continued. Bones slipped out 2 minutes later. The morning proceeded on its documented track, Fontaine, the potion store's analysis, the cross-examination, while something separate and faster was happening outside the building, in the British countryside, where a rat in a garden was about to have a very significant morning. Snape arrived for his afternoon testimony precisely on time. He was exactly what Apollon had expected from his file and exactly different in person. The file described a former Death Eater, a potions prodigy, currently Hogwarts professor, admitted to Dumbledore's confidence. The person who walked to the witness seat was a narrow-shouldered man in severe black robes with a face that had been carefully arranged into absolute neutrality and eyes that were nevertheless the most revealing thing about him, not because they gave anything away but because of how hard they were working not to. He confirmed his identity. He confirmed his position at Hogwarts. He confirmed, under questioning, access to advanced potions laboratories and materials. He denied authoring the behavioral compounds found in Harry Potter's magical system. He denied it well. Not nervously, not with the over-elaboration of a poor liar, but flatly and with the specific tone of someone who had anticipated this question and decided on the flat denial as the strongest available option. Apollon watched him during Beaumont's examination and thought about what Dumbledore had said, "The only person I knew who worked in that style." She thought about the compositional analysis. She thought about the fact that the behavioral compounds were designed to engineer self-sacrifice, and she thought about what Dumbledore had told her, quietly, on the second day of preparation, about what Snape's motivations were likely to be. He had loved Lily Potter. Had loved her since childhood. Had watched her choose James, had lost her to the war, and had spent the years since in a state of complicated grief that had attached itself to her son the way grief sometimes attached, not cleanly, not simply. He hadn't been trying to harm Harry. Or rather, he had and hadn't simultaneously, in the particular way of people whose motivations were wound around something irreducible and painful. He'd wanted Harry to be the thing Lily's death meant, the sacrifice that justified the cost. He'd engineered it. Built it. Not out of malice but out of a grief that had calcified into purpose. Which didn't make it less of a crime. But it made it a different kind of crime than Slughorn's calculus or Dumbledore's managerial certainty, and different crimes had different shapes in a tribunal proceeding. When Beaumont finished, Apollon requested permission from Courvoisier to ask a question directly. Courvoisier granted it. She looked at Snape across the room. He returned her gaze with the careful flatness he'd maintained throughout. "You knew Lily Potter," she said. Not a question. A beat. Yes. When you designed the behavioral compounds in the analysis Dr. Fontaine has presented, and I want to be precise, Professor, I'm not asking if you did it, I'm asking about the design philosophy of someone who did, what would the goal have been? He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind the careful flatness. The goal, he said, would have been to ensure that the subject understood the value of sacrifice. That they didn't flinch when the moment came. Because the sacrifice was necessary. Because the sacrifice was prophesied, he said. And because a person who couldn't choose it freely, who would hesitate, who would fight for themselves when fighting for themselves would cost everything, would fail. And the failure would mean, he stopped. The failure would mean her death was for nothing, Apollon said. The room was very still. Snape said nothing. His jaw was set. If the subject had been allowed to grow up without the compounds, Apollon said, without the engineering, do you think he would have been brave enough to choose sacrifice if it was needed? A longer silence. And then, very quietly, very precisely, yes. So the compounds weren't necessary. He looked at his hands. No. They weren't. It wasn't a confession in the legal sense. But it was something that landed in the room with more weight than a confession, because it was a man arriving, in public, at the conclusion he'd been avoiding. Courvoisier called a brief recess. People moved. Voices started up in the observer gallery, low and fast and urgent. Dumbledore, in his seat, was looking at Snape with an expression Apollon recognized, the look of a man seeing, too late, what another person had been carrying. The Pettigrew development arrived at 4 in the afternoon. Bones came back into the tribunal chamber during the recess looking like a woman who had won something she'd been trying to win for a long time and was feeling all the complicated textures of that. She crossed to Apollon directly. "We have him," she said. "In custody." He reverted to human form when one of my team cast a containment charm around the garden. Apparently his rat body couldn't hold the animagus state under a sufficiently powerful constraint. He's currently at a ministry-secure location under guard by people I personally trust, which is a short list but sufficient. Does he have counsel? He's being processed. He'll have counsel assigned. She paused. He confessed. Before counsel arrived, which his lawyer will argue about, but the confession is on record. He confessed to being the secret keeper, to providing the Potter's location to Voldemort, and to the 12 murders he framed Sirius for. She stopped briefly, he was very frightened. He'd apparently been waiting for something like this for months. Living as a rat in the Weasley household. She looked at her hands. He said he was afraid of Voldemort's followers finding him. He wanted to hide until it was safe. It was never safe. The Weasley family, Apollon said. Did they know? No. That's very clear. They had a family pet for 3 years and didn't know what it was. She looked at Apollon steadily. Molly Weasley is going to need to be informed of all of this. The tribunal findings, the Pettigrew situation, her own role in the compounds, all of it. She paused. I think she genuinely believed she was protecting him. I know. Apollon thought about the letter in her coat pocket, the one from the Dursley kitchen drawer, the careful handwriting and the false warning about magic harming the street. Someone had known exactly how to write that letter to make it land correctly. She was given a story that made her actions feel like love. That doesn't absolve the action. But the person who gave her that story carries the larger share of the weight. Bones nodded. Sirius, she said. He should hear about Pettigrew before this goes public. Not in the tribunal chamber. I'll tell him during the recess. Apollon moved toward the door. Stopped. Looked back at Bones. You did that well. The hunt. The identification. The capture. Bones looked slightly surprised at the directness of this, as though compliments operated differently in her professional world and required a moment's adjustment. Thank you, she said, and meant it simply. Sirius was in the corridor, leaning against the wall with Renard nearby, when Apollon found him. She drew him aside and told him about Pettigrew in the same way she told him things since the beginning, clearly, directly, without softening. He was very still while she talked. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned and put both hands flat against the stone wall and breathed, 1 breath, 2, 3, with his forehead almost touching the stone. Then he straightened. "He's alive," Sirius said. "Yes." "And in custody?" "Yes." "Bones' team. People she trusts." "And he confessed." "Before counsel arrived. His lawyer will challenge it. But it's on record and there's physical evidence, the creature identification scan, the animagus registry discrepancy, the connection to the Potter's house through the secret keeper charm residue that was always on record, just never looked at properly." She looked at him. "Your trial is already in motion, Sirius. This accelerates it. It doesn't change the outcome was already determined by the evidence we had. It means James knew," Sirius said. "In wherever he is. He knows now that it wasn't me." His voice cracked on the last word the same way it had cracked in the Azkaban cell, clean and honest. "He never knew. He died thinking," he stopped. Collected. "He died thinking the best friend he trusted most had sold him." There was nothing to say to that. Apollon didn't try. After a moment, Sirius wiped his face with the back of his hand in a motion that was entirely without self-consciousness. "Right," he said. "Let's go back in." The final session began at 5 and ran until 8. Courvoisier had asked all parties if they wished to make closing statements. The British solicitors made one, measured, conceding several points while arguing that the ministry's actions had been taken in good faith in an extraordinary post-war context. Beaumont made one, precise, comprehensive, declining to be dramatic because the facts were dramatic enough. Dumbledore made a statement that was unlike anything Apollon had ever heard from a defendant in a tribunal proceeding. He stood and spoke for 12 minutes without notes, and what he said was not a defense, not a mitigation, not a redirection. It was a reckoning, specific, unflinching, organized around what he had done and what it had cost rather than what he had intended. He talked about the prophecy. About the 17 years he believed they had and what he'd intended to do with them. About the boy he'd seen in the mirror of his plans, a child prepared, shaped, ready for the moment, and the child he'd understood, too late, existed separately from that mirror. "I told myself I was protecting him," Dumbledore said. "From Voldemort, from attention, from a world that would have put him on a pedestal before he could walk." Some of that was true. The protection from Voldemort was real. The blood wards worked. He survived. But protection that uses the protected person as its own fuel is not protection. It is a different kind of harm wearing protection's face. He looked at the panel. "I am not asking for leniency. I am asking the tribunal to understand that what I did was done in full belief that it was right, and that the belief being genuine does not make the doing of it less wrong. Those two things are both true. I spent many years allowing myself to use the truth of the first to obscure the truth of the second." He sat down. The observer gallery was silent. Sirius was looking at Dumbledore. His jaw was tight. His eyes were doing several things at once. After a long moment, he looked away, and the looking away was neither forgiveness nor its opposite but something that required more time than this room had. Apollon made her statement last. She had prepared one, but as she stood in that clear Edinburgh light with the documentation ranged behind her and the tribunal panel in front of her and the weight of 2 weeks of this work in her chest alongside the truth fire, she found she didn't want to deliver what she'd prepared. She wanted to say something true instead. 340 chains, she said. That's what I found on the 3rd of September, in a windowless office in the British Ministry, when I ran a routine welfare scan across the population registry. A 2-year-old boy with 340 love potion compounds layered through his magical core. Some older than he was. Some designed to make him trust on command, love on command, obey on command. Some designed to make him willing to die. She looked at the panel. In the weeks since, we've identified 4 distinct architects of those chains. Each one motivated by something they believed was necessary. None of them simple villains. All of them capable of telling themselves a coherent story in which what they did was justified, or protective, or loving, or required. She paused. That is what makes this case important, and that is what the tribunal's findings need to address. Not just the illegality of the actions, though they were illegal. Not just the harm to one child, though that harm is real and serious and ongoing. But the pattern of thinking that allows powerful people to decide that they know better than the person in front of them what that person needs, and to act on that knowledge unilaterally, and to call it care. She let that sit. Harry Potter is 3 years old. He is currently in Diagon Alley eating fruit and watching blocks float because his magic is finally free to move the way it should always have been allowed to move. He doesn't know yet what was done to him or how large it was. He knows that he has people around him who make choices on his behalf only when necessary and who are working toward the day when he can make all his own choices himself. She looked at the panel steadily. That's what I would ask the tribunal to protect. Not just this child, in this case, right now. The principle that children are not resources. That vulnerability is not consent. That caring about someone's future does not authorize you to hijack their present. She sat down. Courvoisier called for a recess to deliberate. The panel withdrew at 8:15. They came back at 11:47 at night. Most of the observers had stayed. The gallery was full, which was unusual for proceedings that ran this late, and it was full in a particular way, people who had decided that the outcome of this mattered enough to be present for it, which was its own kind of verdict before the verdict. Courvoisier read the findings in the level, formal voice of a man delivering something that the deliberation had already resolved and that the formality was now simply organizing. Sirius Black, wrongfully imprisoned. Trial mandatory and expedited under ICW oversight. Immediate formal recognition of his status as legal guardian of Harry James Potter pending trial outcome. Harry Potter, Article 9 violations confirmed. All compound sources to be subject to criminal proceedings under ICW Charter. Custody with Veela Council and Black confirmed. British Ministry to provide full remediation cooperation. Albus Dumbledore, stripped of his positions as Supreme Mugwump of the International Confederation of Wizards and Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot, effective immediately. Formal censure on the ICW record. Required submission to a conditions agreement covering ongoing monitoring and mandatory reporting. Horace Slughorn, summons issued. Cooperative surrender recommended. Severus Snape, charges to be formally filed. Extenuating circumstances noted for tribunal consideration. Continued employment at Hogwarts subject to Ministry review and ICW monitoring. Ministry of Magic, formal notice of systemic governance failure. ICW Monitoring Committee to be established. Full review of tribunal practices and detainee rights protocols required within 90 days. Lucius Malfoy, immunity recommendation from the Veela Council noted. Decision deferred pending completion of full testimony. Peter Pettigrew, separate proceedings to be initiated immediately. The gallery erupted when Courvoisier finished reading. Not applause, it wasn't that kind of moment, but voices, all at once, the specific tumult of a large number of people processing the same information from different positions. Apollon sat through it with her hands folded on the table and let it happen around her. She looked at Sirius. He was looking at the ceiling, jaw tight, something working through his face that needed space. She looked at Dumbledore. He was sitting very still with his eyes closed and his hands folded in his lap, and he looked, simply, old. Not diminished, she was careful to read it correctly, but arrived somewhere that he'd always been moving toward without knowing it, and the arriving had cost him something in the way that arriving always costs something. She looked at Snape, who was already standing to leave. He paused in the aisle, turned, and looked at her across the room. The flatness in his face was still there, but something different moved underneath it, not gratitude, not relief. Something more like the expression of a man who has been handed a mirror he didn't ask for and found he couldn't look away. Then he left. Bones appeared at Apollon's shoulder. The Wizengamot is going to respond badly, she said. To the censure on Dumbledore. There are 15 members who have aligned their entire political identity with his leadership. They're going to push back hard. Let them, Apollon said. The findings are on ICW record. They can push as hard as they like. There's also going to be a public response. The Prophet is going to run something tomorrow and it won't be kind, Amelia, Apollon said. Bones stopped. Tomorrow, Apollon said. We can handle tomorrow. Bones looked at her for a moment. Then she smiled, briefly, and it was a real smile, the kind a person produced when they were genuinely tired and genuinely, unexpectedly satisfied, and the two things together created something that looked a lot like peace. Right, she said. Tomorrow.